talk about something and say, "That was me then, but this is me now." "And you were still good friends recently?" Cecilia nodded, opened her mouth, then shut it again, her eyes briefly flicking to the front window. "But you saw each other less and less?" Geneva watched the girl's reaction closely. She flashed back to what Cummings had said about Grace changing over the last year. Cecilia picked up a hobnob and nibbled at the edges, her teeth white and very small. "You know how it is. Work gets more and more important. There's always a deadline." "But it wasn't just that, was it?" Geneva prompted. "Grace changed." Cecilia bit off a chunk of biscuit. She chewed slowly and with what seemed like great concentration. "She got really involved in her studies. I wasn't lying. She was always working somewhere, either in the library or in local archives. But it became something more than just work to her, like a mission or something." Geneva gently put down her tea. "When did you first notice this change?" "Over the Christmas holidays, I'd call her up, say, 'Look, there's sunshine, let's go to Battersea Park or the river.' And she'd say no, she was busy, couldn't spare the time. I only saw her a few times over the whole break. She had changed in other ways too. She had been so carefree and light, and now there was this terrible heaviness to her. She began to lecture me on politics and human rights. I grew up with that stuff. My father teaches at the university in Kampala. I'd come to London to get away from all that. She would read something and then get all worked up about it. Obsessed. She'd tell me all these horrible, horrible things." Cecilia shook her head, her hands furrowing her jeans, pulling and straightening the seams, her eyes darting between the two detectives and the curtained window. "How much do you pay for this flat?" Carrigan's question took Geneva by surprise, almost as much as it did Cecilia. £100 a week." She looked embarrassed, as if she had been exposed as the victim of some scam. "Tough being a student, especially in London, I imagine." Cecilia nodded. "How do you think Grace could afford to pay twice that for a flat in Queensway?" Carrigan asked. "Really?" Cecilia looked genuinely surprised. "She always had money. Not a huge amount, but more than most students. In the first year, she'd often take me to dinner. I felt guilty, but she laughed it off, said it wasn't her money anyway. I got the impression she received a sum from her family every month." Carrigan wrote something down. He'd already checked Grace's bank account, and there had been no sign of any regular deposits. "Do you know anything about this?" Geneva took out the flyer for the African Action Committee, which she had found among Grace's things, and laid it flat on the coffee table. Cecilia glanced at it, not even long enough to read the headline, and looked back up at them. "Gabriel," was all she said. Carrigan looked at Geneva, then back down at the table. "Who's Gabriel?" Cecilia bit into a biscuit. Crumbs rained down on her jeans, and she began picking them up one by one. "Gabriel Otto. I guess he was as close to a boyfriend as Grace had. She met him at the end of her first year. I think she had been impressed by something he wrote in the college paper, but—" She stopped. Geneva could tell that Cecilia was unsure about betraying Grace's confidence. She leant forward. "Go on." I never trusted him. He pretends to be African, but he was born and grew up here. I think he does the whole political thing to get girls. But Grace seemed to like him. Do you know where Gabriel lives? Geneva asked. The girl shook her head. I only ever saw him at college and those African Action Committee meetings. Geneva watched Carrigan scribbling in his notebook, his fingers clenched white against the pencil stem. She knew what he was thinking. The boyfriend, the argument the night of the murder. Did Grace own a laptop? She asked. Cecilia nodded. Of course. It wasn't in her flat. The girl looked surprised, then upset. She was always so careful with it. Always checking she hadn't left it someplace. There was nowhere else she might have stashed it. No, she wouldn't even leave it in her locker. She was so afraid it would get stolen. You haven't been to classes this week? Carrigan noted neutrally, but they both caught a flicker in Cecilia's face before she answered. I've not been feeling well, she replied, at the same moment that Carrigan's mobile rang, causing Cecilia to almost jump out of her seat, spilling what was left of her tea, apologising as she went down on her knees to clear it up. Geneva watched, perplexed. Cecilia was definitely grieving for her friend, but she also seemed terrified of something. Geneva could almost smell the fear coming off her. Was she scared of them? 2 white police, or of something else? She was about to ask her when Carrigan snapped his phone shut so hard it cracked like a whip in the airless room. He held it tightly in his fist until his knuckles turned white. We need to go. Right now. She followed him into the street and watched as he stopped just short of Cecilia's gate, turned and started kicking the nearby dustbin, shouting and swearing as people walked by oblivious, not wanting to get into trouble, not wanting to know, just wanting to get safely home, where the news of Grace's murder had just exploded into 30 million living rooms. Chapter 12. The clip ran for 2 minutes and 23 seconds. It was obvious, both from the extent of her injuries and the jumpy transitions, that the footage had been edited down from a master copy. The clip seemed to have been filmed on a high-quality mobile, possibly an iPhone. The camera framed Grace's face and nothing else. The killer had remarkably steady hands. The lens held a tight close-up, the ends of Grace's hair and chin nudging the edges of the screen. She wore a gag of blue checked cloth. Her lips were pushed back and looked as if they had been peeled to reveal the skeleton grin of her gums. Every time something happened to her off-screen, her face jumped and buckled, the eyes bulging as if trying to escape the confinement of their sockets. That you couldn't see the things done to her, that you could only hear it off-camera, the heavy breathing, the laughter, the slash of knife against flesh, made it worse. And even though everyone sitting in that room knew what had happened, they couldn't stop their imaginations from gliding away, seeing things even more grotesque than what they knew to be so. Grace still had a lot of life in her. That was clear from the violence of her struggle. She hadn't hit that point yet when you realise you're not getting out of this, when you see something in the killer's smile or the way he looks at you, and you know for sure that the real and only reason you are here, tied to a bed, bleeding and wounded and screaming in pain, is so that someone can watch you die. For 2 minutes and 23 seconds, Grace writhed against her restraints, her face draining of blood, glistening in the camera glare. Then came the moment everyone watched the clip on repeat for. The moment everyone told their friends about when they forwarded the link. 3 fingers appeared on screen. They were visible for maybe 2 seconds, but that was all the time they needed to remove the gag. Grace lurched forward, her face shaking with muscular spasms, the breath spilling out of her as if she were vomiting air. Branch turned the volume all the way up, and Carrigan and Geneva could suddenly hear the heavy breathing in 87 King's Court. The sound of a fire engine outside.
The opening and closing of windows in the courtyard, people coming home from dinner and taking off their clothes, running baths and greeting their spouses. Then, all they heard was Grace. A massive intake of breath, her eyes focused on the camera, her lips parted, her voice weak and parched. "Daddy." Just that one word, then a cut, her face appearing at a slight angle to the previous frame, and, as she opened her mouth for a split second, you could catch her life, who she was, the things she'd done, and then it was gone. And she uttered her last words. "Help me, Daddy. Please help me." The clip ended abruptly, leaving a window asking if you'd like to watch it again or see similar items. Jesus Christ. Carrigan's voice was dry and raspy, choked by the thought that this clip was being watched by hundreds, maybe thousands of people, not only here, but across the entire world. "We got a call from YouTube," Branch said, his face red and veined, like someone about to experience a massive stroke. "They yanked the video after receiving several complaints. Christ, I'd have been on the site for nearly 3 hours by then. They thought it was a fake, but they called us just in case." Geneva blinked, trying to rid herself of the dread images she'd witnessed. "Why us? How did they even know this happened in London?" It was a good question, Carrigan realised, wondering why he hadn't thought of it. Branch hung his head, his thick fingers covering his skull. "The video's labelled Murder in Queensway." He looked up at them, his eyes turning black and opaque. "We knew this would eventually leak out," Geneva offered, trying to soften her voice against what she had seen, against the flood of fire snickering up her synapses and rushing through her blood. "You knew someone taped the killing and would post it on YouTube?" Branch shot up, the chair tumbling from under him. "You are obviously a better detective than I ever was, D.S. Miller. Since my career is pretty much crucified because of this video, maybe you want to step in and take my place." "She didn't mean that," Carrigan interrupted, his voice as firm and unyielding as his stare. "Forget the fucking politics for a minute and you'll see it's better this way. The video will help us. We're not seeing anything now, but that's because we're looking in the wrong place." Branch moved forward, so that he was less than 2 inches from Carrigan's face. Geneva saw his hands curled into fists, held rigidly at his sides. "Where in Christ's name are you looking?" Carrigan didn't blink. "Her boyfriend was seen arguing with her the night of the murder," he said slowly. "We're concentrating everything on finding him." Geneva started to say something, then stopped, her eyes darting down to the desk. Branch turned towards her. "Spit it out, Miller, for God's sake, if you have anything else to add." "I think we should be looking at what she was working on. Her dissertation. See if she offended anyone, wrote something that made her enemies." Her gaze remained fixed on the desk, unable to meet the super's glare. Branch stood up and walked towards the window. He stared at the grey sky, then turned back. "A waste of time, Miller. Find the boyfriend. We're not that desperate we have to chase up long shots yet." He looked down, seemed to be thinking about something. "At least, I hope to Christ we're not." The mood wasn't any better in the incident room. The assembled detectives silently hunched over the small computer monitor, the light flickering on their faces as they watched Grace die. Carrigan waited until they were finished, seeing his own thoughts wheeling like dark crows in their eyes, the anger, frustration and fury of the last few days exploding in "fuck" and "Christ" and other more imaginative epithets. He wanted to give them some good news, a promise that this case wouldn't end up unsolved, A silent rebuke filed away in a dark cabinet somewhere, but his eyes could not hide the truth. From here on, everyone's watching us. His voice was measured, calm and controlled, but inside he felt himself shaking. It's already made the TV news. The press will be all over this by tonight. The tabloids will go wild with it tomorrow. He didn't need to explain to them the nature of a case conducted in the public eye, the way it warped procedure, geared up pressure, turned the death of a young girl from tragedy into politics. Branch is apoplectic, as you can well imagine. Some laughs and nods of complicity from his men. Even Carlson, he noticed, was quieter and less bullish than usual. And that means he's had the ACC screaming down the phone to him all afternoon, which means we've now got targets painted on our backs. But, having said that, we have to continue as before, pretend none of this matters. He took a deep breath, knowing that such a thing would be impossible. We've got to look at this video as a break in the case. We've now got something to work on. Berman? DC Berman raised his head from the computer screen, his eyes blinking hard like some nocturnal desert rabbit. "Already on it, sir," he replied. "I'm running the clip through an enhancement program. We should be able to improve the image quality once that's done, maybe see something we can't see now." He spoke in a strange, lilting rhythm, the words breaking off now and then into mumbles and stutters. Carrigan watched him nervously fingering some kind of prayer shawl he wore under his uniform as he returned to his keyboard. "Carlson, I need you to talk to Scotland Yard, see if they have any kind of skin or finger database. The killer showed us his fingers. We must be able to learn something from that." "From a 3-second flash?" Carlson was sitting backwards on the chair, slouching into the frame and running a finger through his elegantly manicured stubble. "I doubt it. All they can tell us is that he's black, and that's bleeding obvious." Carrigan turned his head sharply. "Do it. I'm not asking for your opinion." He took a deep breath. "We know from the clip that the killer is an IC3 male, but that's it. Ask them if there's anything about the shade of his skin, anything we can use to narrow this down." Carlson grumbled and noisily slurped his tea as Carrigan continued. "Also, can we find out what type of phone was used to film it?" Berman looked up. "There shouldn't be a problem once we figure out the resolution and coding parameters, though I can't see how much help it'll be. Bound to be a common one." "Everything we know about this man will help us find him. Everything. We all know what he did to Grace, what he's capable of. The rush he must have experienced during the killing. Uploading the clip is probably his way of trying to replicate it, but soon that won't be enough. He'll want more. They always do." "Do we even have a clue where he uploaded it?" Berman fingered his prayer shawl. "I'm onto it." Carrigan smiled. It was time for some good news. "We now have a lead on the boyfriend, courtesy of Grace's best friend, Cecilia O'Donnell. His name is Gabriel Otto. According to Cecilia, he runs a group called the African Action Committee. There's an AAC meeting in Hackney tomorrow night, which me and D.S. Miller will be attending." He stopped, noticed the dark, hooded glare that Carlson gave Geneva, ignored it, and continued. "Jennings and Singh, I want you to go back to SOAS, find out what you can about this group and about our friend Gabriel." He looked around the room. "This is what we have to deal with now. It's not the way any of us would have liked it, but it's the way it is. Let's use the video to help us catch him." Uploading it was his first mistake. Chapter 13. A small upstairs room of the Queen's Arms just off Mare Street. Carrigan and Geneva paid their £2 entrance fee and climbed the narrow stairs to the weekly meeting of the African Action Committee. They were greeted by a room so packed it felt as if the floor was moving. People sitting on chairs, on the floor, in between the chairs, cramped into corners and up against walls like Mannerist effigies. The heavy smell of sweat, beer and impatience hung like weather in the room. Other smells too, fainter but more unusual. Roots and herbs and strange green drinks swigged from unlabelled bottles. But it was the screaming and shouting that gave them pause, made them feel as if they'd stepped into an alien world. A wailing chorus of remarks, insults and exultations, some in English, others in languages unknown to them, others still in hybrids where English words poked between Swahili and local dialects, their owners shifting from one to another as if some were better suited for particular forms of expression. Carrigan could see Geneva fidgeting and tight-lipped and knew he should feel the same way too, here among people who had lost so much to policemen in other countries. Their eyes locking on the two white intruders, seeing in them past injustices and fresh indignities. But he was enjoying it, the noise and chaos and heat, the utter strangeness of it, here in the heart of London. A young man stood by a chipped wooden lectern. Behind him was draped a large red flag with a crossed-through fist on a white target at its centre. The man's eyes popped and rolled as he addressed the crowd. It was obvious he was loving every moment of it. The catcalls and insults, the exhortations, hollers and electric sting of the room. With each cry from the crowd, his voice rose and glided across the massed heads. Alternately enraged and calm, his hands reaching out as if promising salvation or something better. And I say it again, brothers. We are not brothers. We are not them, and we are not the others. We are our own people. A cheer rose from the packed huddle. The temperature was soaring, an electric fan spinning elliptically, but to no effect, in the corner of the room. These people who call themselves our brothers, they are the ones killing our sons, raping our mothers, destroying our villages, all in the name of brotherhood, of progress, of God. Another loud cheer crested by a stream of booing and insults. The young man smiled and continued, his voice seemingly feeding off the crowd, filling with urgency. Yes, as Jesus declared, each man must atone in his own heart for that which he is not, and each man's heart is a darkness that no other man can hope to penetrate. He took a pause, more for effect than to catch his breath, then continued. We will give them the chance to atone, but if they do not take it, then we must be ready. We must learn from them, these killers, these godless men who try to impose God in our hearts through the sword. If they will not repent, we must use their own ways against them. Another cheer, more booing. Carrigan felt the atmosphere in the room suddenly shift, a subtle variation in the air, like at a football game when trouble is about to kick off. We must make our land a graveyard for all intruders. There is no other way. This is the way of God and the way of man. Booing, screaming, insults, jeers. We must take the Lord to Coney as he has taken it to us. No more! Gabriel Otto stepped back, watching with delight as the crowd erupted. No more blood! No more villages burned to the ground! No more of our children recruited for his war! Booing and cheering filled the packed room until it was hard to distinguish one from the other. Two men, both dressed in ill-fitting grey suits, started fighting near the front. Punches were thrown, glasses crashed to the floor, blood streaked the wall. Carrigan saw Geneva's eyes flicker with fright, wondering what they'd got themselves into. It had now been 24 hours since they had seen the YouTube video. 24 hours of flashed images, scrolling film, echoed screams. 24 hours of newspaper headlines and breathless news reports. By the time they'd seen the video, it was being watched all over the world. Branch explained that although YouTube yanked the clip, a host of mirror sites were already streaming it, an exponential splash of horror bouncing across the web from one site to the next. Atrocity sites. Sites where you could watch the flicker of your sickest nightmares. Carrigan had spent an hour going through these sites earlier that morning, entering a realm that fed on and relished what the normal world abhorred. He'd thought he'd seen the worst in his years as a detective, but he now realised he'd seen nowhere near the worst. With each click of the mouse, there were darker worlds and blacker provinces yet. It had started with photos of car crashes, DIY accidents and impaled bodies on park fences. From there, it was both inevitable and logical that smuggled photos of torture and executions in South American prisons should appear. That people filmed their friends overdosing rather than trying to help them. The morning newspapers had all carried Grace's face, frozen mid-frame, splashed across their front pages, the headlines each trying to trump one another. Werewolf of London strikes. The iPhone killer. And, the one Carrigan liked the best, the Valentine Slayer. People's faces on the tube were wrapped with a deeper concentration than usual as they scanned the latest edition of the Standard, the steady pulse of their lives hiccuping for just one moment and then returning to normal. Phone calls had come in like artillery barrage, impossible sightings and hoaxes, fake confessions and religious ravings. Carrigan could feel the case starting to slip away from them. There was so much they didn't yet know. So many moments lost to them. The only thing they knew for sure was that the man standing on stage, Gabriel Otto, head of the African Action Committee, was probably the last person to see Grace Okello alive. Carrigan had obtained a copy of Gabriel's photo from SOAS and shown it to Mrs. Najafi in King's Court. She had confirmed that Gabriel was the man who had been shouting and cursing outside Grace's door the night she was killed. Carrigan stared at Gabriel. His hair was cut tight against the skull, his eyes unnaturally bright, as if a fire smouldered silently beneath them. He wore a neatly tailored brown suit. He was short and wiry, yet gave the impression of someone bigger. Something in the way he moved, a feral sort of calm and poise. Could this be Grace's killer? Was it possible to look someone in the eyes and see the residue of their history illuminated there? Next time they come for our children, we will be ready. Gabriel's voice had soared above the maelstrom, effortlessly enunciating each syllable, the sibilants crackling against the microphone like lightning strikes. Not just Coney and his men, but Museveni too! A loud cheer rippled across the room. Several men stood up and shouted in Swahili, their arms outstretched, making shapes in the air, as if too incensed for language. Yes! Our president, who helps us with our milk and babies. Our president, who hires mercenaries and sends them into the northern jungles to hunt for Coney. Who tells them, anything you come across on the way is yours. And where are we in all this? Where do we fit in between one madman armed with the 10 Commandments and a machete and another armed with UN resolutions and IMF funding? It is time to take action. We must arm each and every villager. The old man who does nothing but stare at the river.
The young girl who only wants to meet her boyfriend in the bush. This is the true gospel, brothers and sisters. The gospel of blood and retribution. This is how we will earn our place in heaven. Gabriel bowed theatrically as the room exploded into clapping, booing, the smack of fist against flesh, a rushed and cramped pandemonium that brought a huge smile to the young man's face. Carrigan watched as a group of men immediately surrounded Gabriel. Black-suited, his bodyguards or disciples, it was hard to tell which. People got up from their seats, still arguing with their neighbours, trading insults in both word and gesture, gathering their things, making their way out into the frozen London night. Some tried to shake Gabriel's hand or say something to him, but the bodyguards kept him inviolable. He spoke to his congregation through the curtain of bodies like John Paul II in his Popemobile. Carrigan and Geneva waited until the crowd thinned out. They scanned the room, watching the people, all of them averting their gaze except for one man, standing against a side wall, a big, rangy brute with bloodshot eyes, cropped black hair and white beard. Every time Carrigan looked, the man was staring directly at him, unabashed and with a smile on his face. It wasn't the man he'd seen outside King's Court and near Cecilia's flat, he was certain. But there was something vaguely familiar about him, a feeling that made the back of Carrigan's neck itch. He crossed the hall, Geneva at his side, as every face turned to watch them, immediately marking them for what they were, white and police. As they approached Gabriel, the bodyguard seemed to contract like a curtain being pulled shut. Carrigan flashed his warrant card, but the bodyguard in front of him didn't even glance at it. He stood, arms crossed, his head round and shiny as a bowling ball, a look of surly indifference, learned from the bouncer's rulebook, plastered across his face. "We'd like to talk to Mr. Otto," Carrigan said, his voice flat, brooking no argument. But the bodyguards didn't budge until Gabriel himself tapped the two in front of him lightly on the shoulder. "You don't like what I'm preaching?" he said to Carrigan, ignoring Geneva, his accent pure North London sass and glare. "I couldn't care less about that," Carrigan replied. "This is about grace." He caught the slight squint in Gabriel's face and the one-word command that sent the bodyguards back into formation, impenetrable as a concrete wall. He saw Gabriel disappear through the stage door, flanked by two massive acolytes. He pushed against the curtain of bodyguards, calling after Gabriel, but it was like trying to walk through a brick wall. He began to reach for his truncheon when he felt two hands, cold and hard as steel, clamp themselves around his arms, and then, before he could take another breath, his feet were off the ground. The bouncer lifted him until they were eye level.
"Mr. Otto does not want to see you,"
he said, his breath dank and rotten like something found under a rock. Carrigan tried to twist out of the bouncer's embrace, but it felt like his arms were trapped in a vice. "Get your hands off him now!" The bodyguards looked at Geneva and laughed. Carrigan stared at the bouncer's eyes, and 20 years peeled back like a curtain as he felt the blood filling his mouth again, the stench of the cell, the broken teeth scattered across the floor. The bouncer's voice snapped him back to the present.
"Please, go home. This is no place for you. This is our affair, our history, our future. None of this is your business."
"A girl has been murdered. That's our business." Geneva stood to the right of Carrigan, fingers cradling her can of pepper spray, trying to slow her heart so that her voice wouldn't tremble and falter. The bodyguard put Carrigan down and examined Geneva as if she were a strange dish he was surprised to find on his plate. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle.
Our girls are being murdered every day back home. Coney's troops come and rape them until they die. Then the government comes, and those that have survived are accused of collaboration. This happens every day, for every week, and every month of every year. And here you come and tell us a girl has been murdered, and you're all concerned, and you want to talk to Mr. Otto. Well, one girl is nothing. You do not live every day with death. You do not know how death becomes your life, how it loses its power when you rub shoulders with it every moment of your existence.
Carrigan couldn't help thinking he'd just summed up what it was like to be a murder detective, while Geneva looked stymied by the bodyguard's eloquence and reasoning. Carrigan could see her weighing options, her hand fidgeting her belt. There was no way past the bodyguards. Gabriel was probably long gone via a back door, vanished into the London night. All Branch needed now was a race riot, accusations of racial insensitivity. He looked at Geneva and, with relief, saw that she had come to the same conclusion. Every murder, every single body we take seriously here, he said. Maybe if you did that over there, things wouldn't have got so out of hand. The bodyguard's fist came so fast he had no chance to duck or flinch. The blow landed square on his jaw, and suddenly the world was black and silver. "Tell Gabriel I'll be waiting for him," Carrigan said, through a mouth filled with blood and pain. He rubbed his jaw and nodded to Geneva. They turned and walked slowly through the now empty hall, waiting for the lunge of a knife, another fist, but there was nothing. And when they entered the chill evening air, it felt as if they had been trapped inside that room forever. Chapter 14. Carrigan stared up at the grey tower blocks stacked against the dismal sky. Winter was finally here. Frost on the ground crunching under their feet, a chill in the air which required gloves and face protection. He took a sip of watery coffee, then spat it back out, watching it melt the frost surrounding his feet. He stared back up at the towering estate, counting floors, wondering if Gabriel Otto was at this moment staring back at him from one of the high, blacked-out windows, watching the team stamp their feet as they waited for tactical to arrive. It hadn't been Carrigan's idea. Branch had called him in this morning, all pained smiles and polite chit-chat, but he'd got to the point quickly enough. He had heard about the AAC meeting, the bodyguards, the rebuff, and was sending a team to arrest Gabriel. How had Branch found out? Carrigan took out a pack of Tic Tacs and swallowed several. It wasn't something he wanted to consider right now. He waited as the tactical support team arrived and kitted up out of the back of a police van, like gladiators preparing for some dark spectacle. He stood in the cold, wet wind, watching the spitting rain carouse off the pocked concrete buildings, the early morning straggle of workers hunched into themselves, eyes red and bleary, setting out into another day, knowing that at the end of it they'll return here to the grey gloom and cramped rooms of this dying estate. They split into 3 teams, one for the stairwell, another for the lift, one outside to catch any runners. They talked and chatted for as long as possible, putting off the moment, but Carrigan could see they were all fired up and waiting to go. He remembered days when he'd arrive at work in the same state, couldn't wait to knock heads, break doors, chase leads, but those days now existed only in memory. "We ready?" The TAC team commander's voice cut through the drizzle and mist. Carrigan knew him, but couldn't remember where from, the years and cases running into one. The smell of piss and vomit surrounded them as they split between stairwell and lift. That the lift even worked was a miracle in itself. Nothing had been done to prettify these common spaces. There were only chicken cartons reeking of oil and fat, broken vials cracking under their feet, graffiti so impenetrable it could have been conceptual art. The door splintered with one swing of the ram, snapping the morning with a scream of cracking wood. Carrigan went first into a narrow, humid hallway, books and magazines stacked up on either side of the floor, the smell of old laundry heavy in the air. He could hear the stuttered footsteps of his men behind him, see the fogging of the windows against their breath, heard shuffling and swearing in the room off to his right. He signalled the sergeant, and together they took the door. Gabriel Otto was sitting upright in bed, bare-chested and sweat-slicked, smoking a joint. His eyes turned hard and shiny as marbles when he recognised Carrigan. The bed began to move, the sheets rippling and snagging, slowly revealing a foot, an ankle, the pale white skin of a girl, her legs blue-veined and alabaster. She raised her head, rubbed the sleep out of her eyes with a clenched fist, and registered Carrigan and his men, blinking and staring at them as if they were alien creatures, things that weren't meant to be seen when awake. Gabriel took another toke and laid the spliff in an ashtray beside the bed. "Put your clothes on, we're going to the station." Carrigan tried not to look at the girl, her sleep-rumpled body slowly unfurling into the morning. "What's going on, Gabriel?" she said, her voice wispy and accented in the stuffy room. Gabriel ignored her, reached for the joint, about to take another drag, when Carrigan slapped it out of his hands. "You better get dressed." Carrigan smiled as he picked up a pair of trousers hanging off the back of a chair and handed them to Gabriel. "You're making a big mistake," the young man replied, struggling into his trousers. Carrigan threw him a shirt. "Get some new lines, Gabriel. Heard that one countless times." He looked away, disgusted. The girl grabbed Gabriel's hand and asked him when he'd be back, her eyes milky and unfocused, still lost in dream melt. She pulled him down and whispered something in his ear. Gabriel turned towards her, a smile lighting up his eyes, then struck her cleanly across the face. The sound cut through the room, through the bustle of policemen searching the flat, the buzz of the elevator and the garbled talk of neighbours gathering outside the door. The girl's face blushed red. Gabriel's handprint visible on her left cheek. Carrigan leant forward and took Gabriel's arm, twisting it behind his back and snapping on the cuffs. He used his body as a weight to pin Gabriel to the wall, breathing heavily, feeling as if his heart was about to explode. Gabriel made some kind of clicking sound with his teeth, and Carrigan brought his foot down hard on the young man's instep, feeling a small measure of satisfaction as he let out a long, agonised moan. Chapter 15. Ex-boyfriends can be a pain, but they certainly have their uses, Geneva thought, stubbing out her cigarette. She watched the people walk by, their day unclouded by death, and though she envied them this, she knew her life could be no other way. Mothers with prams, postmen and Polish builders, a young black man talking into a mobile phone across the street from her. She looked back, sure that he'd averted his eyes the moment she looked at him, and she remembered Carrigan's reaction outside Cecilia's flat. She looked up, but the man had gone, and she shook her head, knowing she was imagining things, putting it down to her nervousness at meeting Lee again after all these years. She smoked 2 more cigarettes outside his house, turning up the volume on her iPod until it was so loud she couldn't bear it. When she stubbed out the 3rd cigarette, she knew there was no more time to prevaricate or wander round these old familiar streets. She was here because a girl was lying dead in a West London morgue. She was here because no one else thought that Grace's thesis had anything to do with her murder. She knew Carrigan didn't think much of her theory. He still saw it as a sex murder, lust and compulsion, not politics the motivator. She didn't think he trusted her. Branch's involvement had pretty much guaranteed that, yet it was strange how every time Africa came up, Carrigan's face pursed and his lips turned white. Was this something she needed to put into her report to Branch? She crushed the cigarette under her shoe until the tobacco and paper disintegrated. She thought of her mother's constant tirades against collaborators and cowards, the usual dinner-time refrain over a couple of bottles of wine. Her mother would never forgive her. Would she be able to forgive herself, she wondered, as she walked past the swinging gate and up to the front door. Are there acts you commit which cannot be forgiven even by yourself? The doorbell chimed a melody of something trite and heard on too many adverts. She made an effort to stand straight, stop her hands from fidgeting, her voice from cracking. 10 years since she had last seen Lee. 10 years and different lifetimes. But here she was. He was surprised, but not that surprised when she'd called late last night. Lee could never really be surprised, she remembered, not when you believe the world is as unpredictable and chaotic as he did. Or maybe he'd changed. She wasn't the same woman she'd been when they first met at East Anglia. She wasn't the same woman she'd been when they moved back to London, set up in a flat off the Kilburn High Road, her walking the uniformed beat day in, day out, in wind and rain and snow, and him packing his leather bag, furiously writing notes through the night, calling sources, off to another war zone to write his pieces on misery and suffering and pain. But he knew Africa, she reminded herself, fighting the urge to light another cigarette. And, last night, going through the notes she'd made at the African Action Committee meeting, going through Grace's folders full of references and citations, she realised how hopelessly lost she was in all this. To understand Grace's death, she needed to understand the context of her life. "Oh, my God. Geneva," Lee said, opening the door, his face still a young man's, breaking into a smile she remembered so well, a plump pink baby cradled in his arms. "Lee," she replied, and for a moment neither said a thing, standing frozen on either side of the door. "Come in, sorry," he apologised. The baby began crying. Lee stroked his forehead and turned back into the corridor. Geneva followed him, trying to corral all the feelings welling up inside her. Lee settled down in North London, a baby in his hands, another woman, another life. This was work, she told herself. Only work. Lee led her into the main drawing room, then excused himself, taking the baby upstairs. She was glad for this momentary respite. She settled down into the worn brown sofa and put her earphones away. She was dying for a smoke, but there were no ashtrays anywhere, nor the smell of extinguished cigarettes. She remembered their first flat, the noise and damp and constant pall of smoke. Her smoking, him puffing away non-stop as he worked another deadline through the night. The thought made her stomach twist, and she felt suddenly dizzy. She wondered whether this was a good idea, whether she should have just contacted someone at the university for the information. But before she could rush out of the house, Lee came in with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a smile that took her back to younger years. "Oh, Geneva," he said again, gently setting down the coffee. His hand brushed her shoulder, and she felt a tremor in her bones, but that was all. Too many years had gone by for them to kiss or hug or even shake hands. He sat opposite her on a leather chair that was falling to pieces. It was falling to pieces 15 years ago, and she suddenly had a memory snap of the two of them making love on it some evening in the mid-90s, and the insistent smell of leather and coffee was almost too much. "Still a cop, then?" His voice sounded different, lower, drained of excitement and mystery. She nodded. "Still a journalist?" Lee's eyes clouded. "Yes and no. Lifestyle journalism, they call it." His voice took on a harder sheen. His eyes looked anywhere but at hers. I write about IKEA houses and Belgravia dinner parties. He laughed, and Geneva did too, though both knew there was nothing funny about it. Believe me, society dinners can get every bit as brutal and savage as civil wars. And this time it was the genuine Lee laugh, the one that got him out of trouble too many times to count, the one that got him Geneva all those years ago. She stared up at the framed photos on the wall. You're happy with the choices you made? Lee looked away, across the hall, then back at Geneva. What kind of question is that, Jenny? The use of her nickname startled her. She hadn't heard it spoken in so many years. I'm sorry. And you? He said. What about your choices? Did you make the right ones? I'm happy being a cop. I meant Oliver. It was like a blow you expect, and all the more painful for it. It was all the years collapsing into each other. The day on the platform at King's Cross, saying goodbye, Lee crying, her crying. Oliver waiting for her in his house up in the north, the end of childhood and the beginning of something else. I didn't leave you for him. Didn't marry him because of you. I know, Jenny, I'm not talking about that. Your mother told me what happened. The undercover work. Oliver and the other woman. I'm sorry, I don't want to bring all this up. I just want to know you're okay. She reached out her hand, met his halfway across the table. Their palms fell into each other like it hadn't been 10 years. I'm okay now. And you're happy? She gently pulled her hand away. Now you're the one asking stupid questions. And for a moment the years faded and disappeared, and she was sitting here with the man she loved, and this was their life 10 years on, in a quiet suburb, in a nice house, a baby upstairs, a life fulfilled. But when the baby started crying and Lee got up, she suddenly remembered who she was again. Suddenly, the room felt intolerable. Suddenly, she felt light-headed and sick. The dark, the smell of baby things, the look on Lee's face as he came back in. This was all a mistake, she realised. One big fucking mistake. You can never go back. You said you wanted to pick my brains about Africa. It's a case I'm working on. She was relieved for the change in topic, reached down and pulled the notes from her bag. The dead girl on YouTube. Geneva nodded. Everyone, it seemed, now knew Grace as the dead girl on YouTube. I remember you spent a lot of time in the Congo, Uganda, Sudan. Lee nodded. She could see a part of him slip away to God knew what horrors and frights in jungles and deserts, but it was a look of sad remembrance, not relief or happiness. I'm having trouble with the background on this case. Grace was involved in East African politics. She was writing a thesis on insurgency in post-colonial Africa. She was from Uganda. I was at this meeting yesterday, and I didn't understand half of what they were saying. It was all acronyms. NRA, LRA, SPLA. I remembered you used to cover the region, she continued, hoping Lee didn't catch the stumble in her voice. What can you tell me about Ugandan politics, especially radical stuff? Radical? Lee laughed. It's all pretty radical compared to what we call politics here. Where do you want me to start? He told her of the missionaries spreading through Uganda in the 1870s, the first whites to expand into the land. The formation of the Uganda Protectorate in 1894 under the aegis of the British East Africa Company. The long, bitter years of colonialism, then the shock of the New World Order. The Obote coup in the 1960s, counter-couped in 1971 by Idi Amin. The years of torture, repression and economic collapse. Then the Tanzanian invasion in 1979, the deposing of the paranoid Amin and the return of Obote. Obote's deposing by another general, and his subsequent removal 6 months later in the Bush War by Museveni's National Resistance Army. Museveni is seen by the West as some kind of paragon, in African terms at least, but he's not that much better than those who came before, a virtual one-party state, torture and intimidation, your basic African politics.
What about Joseph Kony? They kept talking about taking arms against the government and against Kony.
Lee leant back and laughed. Oh, Kony's a true character. Something only Africa could have produced, and within that, something only Uganda could have come up with. There's something about that country which drives people to extreme religious outpourings. It's like Jerusalem, except without any historical antecedents. Cults and religious groups have always flourished there. Kony's only the last in a long line of self-appointed mystics and leaders. In the end, though, there's no heaven on earth, no peace and goodwill. There's only severed ears, abducted children, and mass rape.
My victim was looking at the use of torture as policy. How does that link with all this? She felt better talking about these far-flung worlds, as if, after all these years apart, they could only talk through a barrier, like inmates in a prison.
Everyone uses torture and terror. It's a way of life out there, but no one wants to admit to it. It's all being done behind closed doors, in cells and dungeons far away in the jungle. This is no longer the time of Idi Amin, where the secret police's torture cells were located on Kampala's main street, the windows always left open, so that women on their way to market, kids coming back from school, could hear the screams 24 hours a day. That's all hidden now. There's too much at stake. Massive loans from the IMF, development grants, foreign aid, all that money disappears when allegations of torture and human rights abuses come up. They're learning to play the game. To hide what the West doesn't want to see and cash their checks. The IMF and aid agencies, they don't really care. Out of sight and all that. They just don't want to hear the screams while they're partying. So, yes, anyone who was going to expose any of this, especially government torture, well, you can imagine. She could see the faraway look in his eyes, the hunger for action and danger. It was what had attracted her to him in the first place. But what happened when you could no longer achieve those goals? What happened to your life when you voluntarily gave in? Now, Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army are a whole different thing.
We're still talking Uganda, right?
Lee nodded. He got up and walked over to his laptop, unplugged the power cord and brought it back to the table. Northern Uganda. Kony's Lord's Resistance Army has been operating there since 1987. If you want to understand Uganda, you need to understand Kony. They sat side by side on the sofa. Lee was close but not touching. It begins with Alice Auma, a native Acholi from northern Uganda, a Catholic convert who worked as a medium. One day, she's contacted by the Holy Spirit, who tells her it is her God-given duty to overthrow the Ugandan government, the government that, since Museveni took over, has been persecuting her people, the Acholi. She starts the Holy Spirit movement. She's well respected, and her powers are venerated. Many join. It's a strange army, led by this woman, part saint mystic, part holy warrior. They suffered terrible defeats at the hands of the Ugandan army. They bless stones so that they'll turn into grenades when the enemy soldiers walk over them. They rub anointed oil on their bodies to protect themselves from bullets. They march in cross formation, singing hymns. This is a popular uprising turned into holy war. The government clamps down hard, and Alice is exiled. The movement splits into many splinter groups. Among those is one led by Joseph Kony, who says he is a cousin to Alice, and that he too has received a message from the Holy Spirit. He forms the Lord's Resistance Army in 1987, a band of Christian guerrillas who want to implement a theocratic state based on the Ten Commandments. Many join. Kony is charismatic and charming. And what's more, under his leadership, they start winning decisive battles against the Ugandan army. They had up to 3,000 soldiers at one point, some say even more.
Villagers?
No, the villagers were sitting on the fence. They feared the LRA and they feared the government troops. Coney's speciality was abduction. 90% of his soldiers were child abductees. They abduct boys and teach them to fight. They make them rape and kill, often their own families, to bond them to the LRA. Then they give them a gun and send them out to battle. The government soldiers have families back home. They're doing it for the money in a country where unemployment is disastrously high. The child soldiers kill because that's all they know. The villagers are in between. Coney's men come and take food and abduct their children. Then the government troops accuse them of helping the LRA and burn down their huts, ship them off to a refugee camp for their safety. They also do their fair share of raping, looting and killing. There's nearly 2 million people still living in filthy refugee camps since 1996, when the government forcibly evicted them. These poor bastards are caught between. No one cares. It's not Rwanda or Bosnia. It's too complex. There's no good guys and no way to see a resolution. It's one of those wars that goes on for so long that the reason no longer becomes its meaning, only the cycle of retribution and blood. It's the closest we humans have come to creating a perpetual motion machine. She thought back to Gabriel's impassioned speech the previous night, the call to arms. She could understand his position. Her mother would even donate time and money, but Geneva couldn't see how more guns could help. She looked up at Lee, and there he was, the 22-year-old boy she met at university again, his face younger, his eyes bright. She blinked away the thoughts swirling through her head and took out Grace's notes and essay plans. There's a lot of references to something called the black-throated wind. I think Grace was concentrating on that, from the look of things. Do you know anything about them? Lee's face became tight, his lips almost disappearing. He looked away. It's not a them. It's a him. Geneva felt her skin tingling at the word him.
Who is he?
His name is Lawrence Ngomo, but he called himself the Black-Throated Wind. He had many other names too. Lee shook his head. I met him once. Shit, Jenny, you still smoke? She nodded, took out her pack of Lucky Strikes.
You allowed to smoke in the house?
Lee shook his head. Nope. I haven't touched one of these for 7 years. He took 2 cigarettes out of the pack and put them both in his mouth, lighting them simultaneously before passing one to her. It was a gesture she remembered well, and something in her chest felt like it was popping. Her hand shook as she took the cigarette.
Shouldn't we go outside?
Lee stood up and opened the window. Fuck it. I haven't done this in too long. He sat back down next to her. Ngomo's a piece of work, he continued, coughing, taking deep drags on the cigarette. He's belligerent, violent, paranoid, and holds grudges forever. He wouldn't answer any of my questions when I interviewed him. When I asked him why he wanted to do the interview, he told me he fancied killing a white man today, but that he'd changed his mind. Geneva smiled.
Nice. Who is he?
He was one of Coney's lieutenants. Then he split off, set up his own splinter faction, called himself the Black-Throated Wind. There's a lot of rumours and not much fact. People saw him as some kind of religious saviour. They say he modelled himself on Savonarola, the medieval Florentine monk who created the bonfire of the vanities. Ngomo didn't burn luxuries, though. He burned villages. He believed that the land was cursed by blood, and that only through fire, by clearing the land and starting again, could peace come.
He had followers for this?
She was always amazed at how people fell so willingly for anyone who promised to return to some mythic former age. Many. You have to realise that someone like Ngomo makes the world very simple, and a lot of people are drawn to that. They believed him a saint, something more than human, sent down from heaven to purge the land. Many people claim to have seen him walking across the surface of Lake Albert. They say he recreated the eastern wall of the Jerusalem temple in the bush, stone by stone, that he translated the Bible into Luganda, changing a word here, a word there, until its meaning had changed too. Lee took a deep breath, crushed out his cigarette. There's substantial evidence he was involved in the murder of those aid workers back in 1990. You remember that? She shook her head. 4 British girls on their gap year, trying to do something meaningful rather than just getting drunk and sunburnt, working for one of the food aid NGOs. One was the daughter of a backbench MP, one was a doctor's daughter. Good girls from good families. When they didn't turn up at their base in Gulu, a massive search entailed, but it was fruitless. A few weeks later, a video began turning up in West African markets and backroom shops. The video showed the girls praying, then cut to a shot of them dead on the ground. There were always rumours that an unedited version existed, but it was never found. There was a lot of noise in the British press at the time, a speech in Parliament, but the Ugandan government insisted that the girls' killers were themselves dead, the result of army gains in the north. She scribbled it all down, feeling something in her blood fizz and jump. What happened to Ngomo? He disappeared around 7 years ago. Some of those closest to him said he'd had a revelation in the bush, saw God, renounced the sword. Others say his body is rotting in the long grass, shot by an 8-year-old near the town of Baringo. What do you think? Lee's face creased into a grin she knew well. I think he's a lot closer than that. She looked across the room, and their eyes met. Lee? He stared down at his shoes. I think he got out when he could. There was an international warrant for his arrest that was rescinded 7 years ago. They have never done that before. I think he gave up names and positions in return for immunity. You think he's living here? Lee got up, went upstairs, came back down with an old dusty file. He flicked through it, then stopped and pulled out a yellowed copy of the Daily Mail from 2 years ago. He sat down and opened the paper, turning to the centre spread. War criminals living large in London, the headline ran. 8 grainy black and white photos underneath. Lee's finger hovered over the second from last, an old man with grey hair and a black moustache, the name Lawrence Ngomo in 10-point type under it. I think he made a deal. Got some kind of immunity and residence here. He stopped and looked at her, something flickering behind his eyes. It makes you wonder, though, what he could have given them that was worse than the killing of the aid workers. Chapter 16. The interview room was cold and damp. It hung in their nostrils and crept through their clothes as they sat across from Gabriel Otto, watching him strip a packet of cigarettes to fine cardboard streamers. What are you going to make out of that? Carrigan leant forward, his breath heavy with coffee and fatigue, the exertion of the arrest having taken its toll. A key to get out of this room? Gabriel continued stripping the pack, ignoring the 2 detectives, his eyes focused intently on the object in his hands. You missed one, Geneva said, and Gabriel looked up, his lips slowly peeling into a smile. You could be halfway pretty if you tried. Geneva felt Carrigan tense, a slight shift in the room's pressure. She looked at him, shook her head, and turned back to the suspect. Why did you kill her, Gabriel? Her voice was cold and uninflected. Or should I call you Derek? She stared into his eyes, forcing herself not to smile. His head snapped up, a look of pure malevolence in his eyes. No one calls me that. Geneva pulled a sheet of paper from her file, slid it across the desk. Your parents did, at least according to your birth certificate. Gabriel dropped the shredded cigarette pack and stared directly at Geneva. She could feel the skin on her arms contract, a tiny burst of panic deep down in her gut. Gabriel put his hands on the table, his fingers skinny as pencils. "What the fuck do you want?" Geneva leant forward and pushed a stray hair neatly behind her ear. "When did you last see Grace?" "Don't remember," he replied, his voice steady and even. "Maybe the day before she was killed. Maybe the week before. Who keeps track?" "How about on the night of her murder?" Geneva kept her hands on the table, noticing Gabriel staring at her fingers, admiring her nails. "We have witnesses who saw you, who heard you arguing with Grace the night she was killed. Those courtyards carry sound. You were Sunday night's entertainment, the building's very own reality show. Then she threw you out. You banged on her door and shouted and threatened to kill her." "Wouldn't be a relationship if he didn't threaten to kill the little woman every now and then." He glanced at Carrigan. "Except this time, you went ahead and did it." Gabriel sighed theatrically, his eyes roving Geneva's neckline. "You've got nothing," he said, his voice like a kid who didn't get the birthday present he'd been expecting. "How do I know that?" "Because I did nothing, apart from argue with her and bang on her door a few times." "So, you admit you were there that night?" Carrigan said. Geneva tapped out a cigarette and offered Gabriel one. "Just as long as you don't destroy my pack." She lit it for him, his hand cupping hers before she could pull away. "I told you, I didn't kill her." "You need to convince us of that." "Everything says you did it. The witnesses, the forensics, the video footage." Gabriel slammed his hand flat on the table. "When I left, she was still alive. Alive enough to fucking shout and call me a collaborator." Geneva's eyes flicked up. "Collaborator? What did she mean by that? Who did she think you were working for?" They both caught the momentary look of panic in Gabriel's expression. Okay, fuck it," he finally said, looking down at the table. "If I tell you what happened, then you'll let me go, right?" Geneva nodded. "We were supposed to be going out that night, but at the last minute she called to say she couldn't make it." "Seems you're not short of company," Carrigan interrupted, liking Gabriel less and less. "Why didn't you take one of your other girlfriends?" "It wasn't like that," Gabriel replied. "White girls are good for sex," looking directly at Geneva. "A bit of fun here and there. Grace was different. She was from home." "You mean Harlesden?" Geneva flashed her teeth. "What's that got to do with it?" Gabriel snapped. "Why do you call Uganda home, Derek, when you were born and raised in North London?" Carrigan was impressed by her change of tone, hard and sharp one moment, the next sounding like a kindly schoolteacher, the type you'd spill all your secrets to. "My father is Ugandan," he replied. "Your country brought him here to work. He never had a choice. Africa will always be home to black-skinned people. Makes no difference where you ship us to." Geneva didn't want to hear his brand of fashionable rebellion. She was sure it went down well with the home county kids at SOAS, but both she and Carrigan had seen enough not to be moved by rhetoric and imprecation. "Tell me about Sunday night, Derek. Don't call me that again." Geneva smiled. "I promise." Gabriel seemed to take this at face value. "There was a Ugandan band playing at the Empire that Grace wanted to see, but it was sold out. I'd managed to get a couple of tickets. Then she calls me up that afternoon and says she can't make it. Just like that. I said, what the fuck? She told me she was meeting someone and then she hung up on me." "So you went over to King's Court to talk to her?" Gabriel nodded. "She was seeing someone else, I was sure of it. Why else break such a date?" Carrigan could think of a multitude of reasons, but kept his mouth shut. Gabriel's bitterness towards Grace was serving them well. "She let me into the flat. She was all dressed up. She had never dressed like that for me." "Dressed how?" Geneva stubbed out her cigarette, her eyes never leaving Gabriel's.
She was wearing traditional clothes, her mother's. It's a sign of respect back home. I asked her who she was seeing tonight, who was so fucking important. She refused to tell me, asked me to leave. So you got mad at her? Well, that's understandable, Carrigan muttered conspiratorially. Of course I got mad. I paid a lot for those tickets, even booked a restaurant for afterwards. Lucky girl didn't know what she was missing, Carrigan replied. I said to her, tell me who you're meeting all dressed up like that. Gabriel continued, oblivious now to the detectives, his mind reliving the evening's slight. She just stood there, shaking her head, saying, you don't understand. I told her I understood fine. She said, you never understand. And then she started laying into me about the AAC, saying I was only doing it to get girls, that I had no heart, that it didn't matter to me what was going on in Uganda. I told her I wasn't leaving. I wanted to see who her new man was. She told me it wasn't a boyfriend. She said it was work. I laughed. This is not an original excuse. This is 6:30 on a Sunday evening. She said she was meeting an important source, someone who knew stuff they shouldn't. She said the man only agreed to meet at her flat. She said this would bring it all together. I didn't believe her. I called her a liar and a whore. She pushed me out of the room. She slammed the door and said she never wanted to see me again. I banged on her door and told her exactly what kind of girl she was. And then? And then I went home. I called Greta, this girl I sometimes hang with, and we went to the show. She didn't get it, but we had a nice time, and I went back to her place. That's all. I never saw Grace again until I switched on the news. Gabriel crushed his cigarette in the ashtray. The room was clouded with smoke, and Carrigan felt that old hunger rising up inside him as he thought about what Gabriel had said. Try this for a minute, he suggested. Imagine you're the policeman and I'm the one feeding you this bullshit story. Would you believe me? Gabriel shrugged, his shoulders angular and spiky, tiny knots of bone. You weren't particularly upset when we saw you at the AAC meeting. Don't give a fuck for her anymore. She used me. She fucking used me, and then when she had someone better, she let me go. You think I'm going to cry over something like that? What do you mean she used you? You sound like a girl, Carrigan said. Not like that, man. She used me for my connections, for her fucking thesis. She cozied up to me, came to all the meetings, hooked up with a lot of emigres from back home. She was always looking for information, always working out who could help her and who couldn't. Gabriel's smile was strange and unsettling. He leant back in the chair. At first, I really thought she had another boyfriend. Then I realised no, she was right when she said she didn't care about that. It was this source that mattered to her more. And she didn't tell you anything more about this man she was supposed to meet, this source. Nah. And if she did, by that point I wasn't listening. All I know is she seemed excited, and Grace only ever got excited when it was about her work. It was like some fucking mission for her. Geneva opened the green file lying on the table, thinking back to how Cecilia had used almost the same words to describe Grace. She took a grainy photograph from the file, looked at it for a few seconds, then slid it towards Gabriel. Gabriel sprang back and almost toppled from his chair, as if the photograph were a snake thrown across the table. So, you do recognise him? Geneva said, watching Gabriel's face drop for the first time that afternoon. Carrigan briefly glimpsed an image of a black man with a small moustache and receding hairline. They hadn't talked about this before starting the interview. He wondered who the man was, and he watched Gabriel looking everywhere but the photo. Geneva was biting the inside of her lip, trying to keep her face blank, but there was no disguising the glee in her eyes. Of course I recognise him, Gabriel said, still avoiding the photograph. Find me anyone from Uganda who doesn't recognise the black-throated wind. Carrigan looked at the photo, seeing a grainy image of a man who could have been any of 1,000 men. Where had she got it from? Was this Branch's idea, or had she found it in the box of Grace's work notes? Was she still pursuing her thesis theory, despite his objections and all the evidence to the contrary?
Tell me about him. Geneva placed her hands on the table, fingers slowly spreading like a fan. Gabriel scraped his chair forward. He took a deep breath, turned over the photo so that only the gleaming white back reflected into the room. The Bible says, "Thou shalt not murder," not, as is commonly thought, "Thou shalt not kill." You understand the difference? I understand that everyone has a different understanding of the difference, Carrigan replied. Geneva looked at him, a smile of mild surprise perched on the left side of her mouth. Well, Ungomo certainly understood. Gabriel continued. The black-throated wind. He said the name with a chilly reverence, a name only to be whispered in shadowed rooms and subterranean spaces. You know why the Bible speaks to us Africans? We believe in it as a literal thing. He didn't give them a chance to answer, in full oratory mode now, his fists clenching the table. The Bible speaks to us because we live in a biblical world, a world of flood, famine and plague. The Bible is never a metaphor for us. It is always a literal telling, the flesh and blood of God. You need to understand this if you want to understand Uganda. If war is your God, then the battlefield becomes your church, the blood and bullets your sacraments. A man like Ungomo, who has no ideology, no politics, whose world isn't filled with complications and mitigations, for a man like that, it is easy to succeed. With only one road ahead, you make many miles. Do you think that Grace's source may have been Ungomo? Do you think it's possible Ungomo set up a meeting and killed her? Geneva turned the photo over. General Ungomo somehow looking more sinister now, his face peppered with stray ash from the table. Gabriel laughed as if he'd just heard the world's funniest joke. He shook his head. You cops are so stupid. He took Geneva's empty cigarette pack and began stripping it. I've told you everything I can about that night. Now either release me or charge me and let me see a lawyer. There was a collision on the south side of the Great West Road, almost directly opposite his flat. A still steaming snarl of metal and glass spread across two lanes. The rain had turned from drizzle to downpour. Red and blue lights cut through the mist and haze like lighthouse beacons. Carrigan locked his car, briefly considered crossing over to the accident site, where two constables were stretching crime scene tape, while medics crouched on the ground, their arms in frenzied movement, their faces intently clenched. But there was no need for him there. They were doing what they could. The traffic was filtered through the left lane, and already there was a chorus of horns, a symphony of different timbres and tones clashing against the bullet spray siren of the approaching ambulance. He could see the vehicle involved, a family SUV, the tyres shredded, thin black tendrils hanging from the undercarriage. A dark smear of blood on the asphalt was already washing away in the rain. Slivers of glass sparkled and shone in the paramedic searchlights like tiny stars against the deep black ripple of tarmac. There was blood on the inside of the windscreen, shrill and bright compared to everything else in the night. In the back seat, there were children's toys scattered and upside-down handbags and summer hats. He tried not to stare, but there's no way you can look away. He could see it in the cars that were passing at a crawl, their occupants' eyes all turned towards the scene, trying to glimpse something, while hoping not to. They'd drive a little slower tonight, he knew, hold their wives' and husbands' hands after dinner, have trouble falling asleep, hearing their child in the cot next to the bed, breathing a little too heavily. But tomorrow they'd be driving again as they always did, convinced of their immortality. He didn't begrudge them their curiosity. In the deepest nights, he knew this was part of the reason he'd become a policeman. He turned, shaking the images from his eyes, and that's when he saw the car. It was the fact that they weren't looking at the accident which made him notice them. Parked on the other side of the flyover, the two occupants shrouded in dark and breath mist. From where they were sitting, they had a clear view of his front door. He tried to think of other reasons for them being there, then crossed the road and headed towards his flat. He'd bought it for the view. That was the joke he told everyone who came here, except it wasn't a joke. The three-bedroom terraced house sat alongside the Great West Road, overlooking the Hogarth roundabout and M4 flyover. His living room window looked out onto the grey stretch of the approach ramp as it spiralled high into the drizzled sky. The traffic never stopped. The city never stopped. He liked nothing better than to sit in the evenings and stare out at the snake of cars hitting the ramp at sunset. The majority heading for the airport, for queues and flights, sunshine and wonder. It had been 20 years since he'd been abroad, but he loved looking at their faces, wrapped in streetlight fix, staring exultantly at the black road ahead and the sky above, as if they'd already forgotten who they were. He picked up his mail and entered the flat. He sensed a difference as soon as he stepped into the living room. He stopped and looked, sniffed. Nothing he could point a finger to. A subtle disturbance of air, a vague, unfamiliar smell. He felt the sweat rolling down his back as he checked the front room and bedroom, but everything seemed in place. He stared through the window out into the night, but the car that had been parked there was gone, a pale scar where it had sealed the asphalt from the rain. He checked the other rooms and then made himself a drink. It was only when he was sitting in his chair that he saw it. A small, brown envelope lying underneath the phone. He put his glass down slowly, careful not to make a sound. He walked over, pulled out a pair of latex gloves from his jacket pocket, snapped them on, and picked up the envelope. There was no name written on the front, and it hadn't been sealed. He felt his fingers tremble as he took out the photographs and stared at them. A picture of him standing outside Ben's house a few days ago. Another of him greeting Ursula at the door. He glanced to the left, thinking he'd heard something, but it was just the boards settling. There was another photo of him saying goodbye to Ben by his front door. Then a new set. Susan and Penny, Ben and Ursula's daughters, on their way to school, standing around the playground, waiting to be picked up outside the gates. Carrigan took a deep breath, flicked through the photos again, and carefully placed them back in the envelope. He poured himself a long drink of whiskey and sat down in front of Louise. He touched her photo, feeling a slight electric charge leap across his fingers, and told her about his day, the weather and the lunch he'd had, omitting the 3 dime bars, and then he told her, like he always did, how much he loved her, how the days dragged interminably without her. Finally, he kissed his fingertips and pressed them against the cold glass. He took a deep breath, feeling her in every crevice and fold of his heart, then made himself a microwave meal which he binned half-eaten, the taste bitter and lingering. He checked the flat again, room by room, until he was satisfied there was nothing else amiss, and then he moved the armchair so that it was facing the door. He sat there until morning, waiting and watching. Chapter 17. More paperwork. Geneva loved it. Most other cops dreaded the moment they had to sit behind a desk and go through pages and pages of seemingly pointless information. They would rather be out on the street, chasing the case. But Geneva knew the case lay in these pages, and not out in the greater city beyond. The music screamed loud, too loud, on her earphones, drowning out the drone of the cranes outside. The light glowed green and sickly, no matter how many fluorescents and table lamps were switched on. The pages began to merge, words and dates no longer differentiated among the mass of notes, ticks, coffee stains, ash and heat. She kept rubbing ointment on her fingers. the stress of the last few days making her skin break out in rashes, red patches and migrating itches. Grace had begun her thesis with the intention of covering 10 or so rebel movements from different African countries. It was a compare and contrast exercise. Charles Taylor, Joseph Kony, Robert Mugabe. The names were familiar and not, sound grabs caught in passing from TV sets and stray conversations. She read long, detailed descriptions of factional dissent, bush tactics, demographic fixing. She flicked and faded and flicked, coke keeping her wired, too far to sneak out for cigarettes. She was going through Grace's recent notes when she noticed that something had changed in her approach. She flicked back, scanned and skimmed the previous term's work, noted that the change had occurred around last January. She leant back and thought about this. She shuffled songs until she found one that suited her. She tried to recall what both the Professor and Cecilia had said. She thumbed through her notebook, seeing the scrawled reminders of the 2 interviews, desperately hoping she had written it down. Miles Cummings had mentioned that Grace's appearance and performance had begun to change when she came back from the Christmas holidays. Geneva took a long drink of coke and flicked to her notes for Cecilia. There it was again. The Christmas holidays. Grace had gone off to the Christmas holidays the same Grace she had always been, yet, when she came back, everything was different. Not only that, but the scope of her thesis began to change radically. From looking at 10 different rebel groups, Grace had focused on just one. A small splinter faction of the Lord's Resistance Army led by General Lawrence Ngomo, a.k.a. the Black-Throated Wind. Geneva swiveled back on the chair, blood pounding through her fingers. She held her breath, released slowly. She had to double-check, verify, find out more before she could be sure, before she could go to Carrigan with this. She had seen his reaction when she'd pulled out Ngomo's photo in the interview room, his face falling as if they'd been friends and she'd betrayed him in some small but essential way. The door opened, and Geneva jumped, gathering herself together, as she saw D.S. Carlson come in, 2 mugs of tea in his hand. "Sorry I'm late, I was chasing something up," he said, by way of apology, handing her a mug and taking a seat next to her. She pulled down the sleeves on her shirt to hide the red patches and began explaining what she'd just discovered. "You sure the dates match?" Carlson was wearing one of his expensive suits. She could see the fine tailoring and raised stitching, the shoes polished until they resembled something made of onyx. She wondered how long he spent on grooming every morning. Much longer than her, she was sure. Both mentioned the Christmas holidays. Something happened to her during the break. It's not just what people said, but also the scope of her dissertation. There's all these references to finding the tapes. She never fully explains this. Carlson smiled one of those smiles. She couldn't tell if it was directed at her or for his own benefit. "I take it, then, that you don't buy Carrigan's sex predator theory." She looked up from her notes, trying to read Carlson's face, but it was inscrutable, the eyes hooded and bright. "The more I find out about Grace, the less I like that idea," she replied, grateful for the opportunity to sound out her theories. She told him about Lee's assertion that Ngomo was living in London. "You should have seen Gabriel's face when I passed him the photo." Carlson ran his fingers through the stubble on his head, the sound crisp and sharp in the still room. "So, Grace was researching this General Ngomo, and somehow he finds out about it. He's been here several years, presumably living under the radar, and suddenly all this is going to disappear because of some student writing her thesis?" Carlson looked up, thought about it, but she suspected he was thinking about something else. "Makes sense. More so than Carrigan's theory that this is just about sex." He took out an unusually shiny apple and began eating it.
I don't understand why he shut you down so quickly.
Geneva felt her skin itch, resisted the maddening impulse to scratch. You know him better than I do. Carlson laughed, almost choking on a piece of apple, coughing and righting himself.
Doesn't like to be contradicted, our Jack, he replied. We've all learned to keep our mouths shut.
She thought about the report she had to write for Branch, due on Monday. Not the first time, then? Carlson turned to her, his voice dropping low.
Not by a long shot.
He smiled, moving his chair closer.
Why would he be so reluctant to follow all possible leads?
I was asking myself the same thing, she replied, then caught something in Carlson's look. You're not going to tell Branch, are you? She was suddenly aware that she might have said too much. She caught herself scratching her wrist, stopped. Carlson shook his head.
I think we're better off giving Carrigan enough rope, eh?
You don't like him much, do you? Carlson shrugged.
He used to be a good copper, is what I heard. But he's got sloppy these last few years. Makes our job that much harder. You remember the leaked government report on police profiling?
Geneva nodded. It had done more damage to the Met than any hectoring independent editorial or police cock-up.
It was Carrigan who left the file in a coffee shop.
She recalled the ensuing scandal, the helpful member of the public who found the document and passed it on to a journalist. She could picture the whole scene in her head. Carrigan taking the last sip of his coffee, his mind elsewhere. What did they do to him?
Moved him to a different station. But this was after his wife. They were feeling more generous than they ought to have been. A slap on the wrist, nothing more.
The mention of Carrigan's wife piqued her interest. She continued going through Grace's notes, flicking through sheet after sheet, trying to hide her expression from Carlson. I noticed he wears a wedding ring. What's up with that? Carlson ran his fingers through his lapels, straightening them and flicking off imaginary lint.
Never took it off,
he replied cryptically. Divorced? She thought of Oliver's voice on her answering machine, the years she wished could be erased from the ledger of her life. Carlson shook his head, his teeth glinting as he grinned.
Nah. Killed herself, didn't she?
Can't blame her, though. Probably couldn't stand Carrigan any longer. Took the easy way out.
Geneva stared at the page in front of her, but the words had become fuzzy. She wanted to turn and punch the smiling sergeant in the face. Her stomach dropped abruptly as she realised that while she thought she had been grilling Carlson about Carrigan, it had actually been the other way round. What had she said? Would this come back to haunt her later? Of course it would, she told herself. Everything you say is only stored away until the day it can be used to hurt you. She smiled thinly and chewed the end of her pencil, wondering what she'd just got herself into. Then, so that she wouldn't think about that, she began thinking about what could possibly have happened to Grace over the Christmas holidays. She focused back on the pages in front of her, Grace's elegant handwriting filling her vision, while Carlson started on another apple. More than ever, she felt the answers would be found somewhere in here. Grace's notes from this year were focused exclusively on General Ngomo. There was a brief summary of his life previous to joining Coney, a short précis worthy of Who's Who. Lawrence Ngomo was born in the Kitum district of northern Uganda sometime in the 1950s. Kitum was part of Acholi land, the ancestral home of the Acholi people. He grew up in the brave and terrifying new world of decolonisation. There were rumours he began a course at university, later to be pushed out during the crackdown on the Acholi people, instigated by a president unsure of their loyalty and troubled by their strange ways, their beliefs in spirit mediums and dark angels. The next time Ngomo appeared, it was as a senior member of Coney's LRA, rampaging through the northeast of the country. There was no indication of what happened in between. It was up to her to connect the dots. One day Ngomo is a student, the next he's a lieutenant in a rebel army. She knew no life was as simple as that, no trajectory so deliberate as when traced out in print. She imagined a young man setting out one morning like every morning before, making his way to classes, books in hand, some lunch packed in a small sack, another day of lectures and essay preparations. Just another day. Then he's turned away from the main gates, or, even worse, called out of the classroom to attend the principal's office. There's the tense and confusing meeting with the head of the university, who apologises profusely and then throws his hands up in the air as if saying, "What the government asks, I can but do." The awkward moments when Ngomo is sitting there, the words tumbling through him, then the realisation that it's over. There won't be that walk tomorrow. There won't be those books under his arm. No more packed lunches. No more essays. Does he argue? Does he shout? Does he try to persuade the principal that he has no politics? Then comes the blank time, the passage between diligent student and rebel commander. It was easy to trace a line where there was none. It was easy to say that his expulsion from university on the grounds of tribal origin put him on this road, which ended with a green uniform and a crouching serenity in the bush, a path that would lead to the days of the black-throated wind. Oh my God! Geneva's head snapped up. Carlson put his apple down and leant over. She could smell the heady scent of his aftershave as she ran her finger down the page of scrawled transcripts. Grace interviewed an ex-child soldier a few months ago. She quotes him in full. Listen to this. General Ngomo liked to get close. He liked to participate when he could. He enjoyed looking into a man's eyes and telling him that he was sorry for what he was about to do, but souls needed saving, and it wasn't his to question the role that God had made him for. Then, while the soldiers held the captive down, Ngomo cut him open and extracted his heart. I saw this myself several times. He had a medium-sized leather bag with him at all times, into which he placed the heart. They say he kept the heart of every man he killed, that deep in the jungle he'd built some kind of temple, and in the deepest room of that temple was a pit filled with thousands of dry and desiccated hearts. He called it his storeroom for the rapture. Carlson let out a deep plume of air, taking the transcript from her, rereading it, his eyes widening with every word. But Geneva was oblivious. She was on hands and knees, unpacking Grace's boxes until she found what she was looking for. It was under all the other books and papers, a slim pamphlet hued in dark red lines. She pulled it out and stared at the cover. The black-throated wind appeared across the top. Below that, the graphic that had so disturbed her when she'd first seen it. A severed human heart suspended in space, dripping streamers of bright red blood. Chapter 18. He'd started to hate coming into the incident room. The pictures of Grace staring at him from the walls, the unspoken disappointment in her face, magnifying day by day until he couldn't bear to look at them any more. The rain was assailing the glass, now that some of the gauze had been removed, and he could hear the short, sharp tattoo as each drop exploded against the window. He checked the daily incident logs, spoke to the Holmes team, and was back at the desk filling in some paperwork when he saw two men enter Branch's office, both black, both wearing suits. He tried to concentrate on the evidence form in front of him, but the sound of argument and raised voices coming from the super's office kept distracting him. He began filling in the action sheets for the week, then turned to his computer and saw that he'd received an email from Derbyshire CID. A young boy had gone missing 2 days previously. Carrigan had a request out for such information. In this new world of computerised policing, it was no longer a matter of random phone calls and crossed fingers. He read the boy's description, saw that it fitted with the rest. Private school, 15 years old, a classical music geek with a good family and better prospects. Until he hadn't returned from school. Carrigan saved the email. He had too much to think about with Grace, and maybe he hoped the boy would turn up. Nothing but a flash of teenage rebellion, gone as quickly as it had flared. 10 minutes later, the team began shuffling in for the evening briefing. Anything? He could hear the sharpness in his tone, the brittle edge that the last few days had worked into his voice. He saw the constables looking down at their tables, the cups of tea in their hand, avoiding the walls, avoiding him. "You're not going to like this." Jennings's voice sounded thin and parched. "But we compared the video footage against the photos we took of Gabriel's hands." Jennings stopped and stared down at his notebook. "And?" "Gabriel's definitely not the man on the video clip," Jennings replied, apologetically. Carrigan rubbed his beard, noticing the bristles had grown longer. "We're sure about this." "Gabriel's skin colour is a lot lighter than the man on the videos. Also, he doesn't bite his nails. The man in the clip does. He may have done something to darken his skin, but there's no way he could have faked that. We also compared Gabriel's fingerprints and they don't match those found at the crime scene." Carrigan put his head in his hands, rubbed the sore spot blossoming on his temple. It only confirmed what he had already known. They hadn't had enough evidence connecting Gabriel to the actual crime scene and had had to release him without charge a few hours earlier. Branch had been furious, calling Carrigan into his office, shouting and cursing before Jack had even had a chance to sit down. Carrigan explained that if they charged Gabriel with so little evidence, it could seriously derail the chances of getting a conviction, if he was indeed the killer. But Branch wasn't interested in that. Branch wanted an arrest, a press conference, newspaper headlines, and no more phone calls from the assistant commissioner. Carrigan turned to Berman. "Any luck with a video clip?" Berman looked up from his screen and hunched his shoulders. "Oh, the clip was definitely filmed on an iPhone. The software used to edit the footage is easily available for free on the web. I'd say by looking at the editing that we're not dealing with a professional, but at the same time, this isn't the easiest software to operate, so we're not talking about a beginner either." Carrigan looked out of the window at the green sky, thinking how the planning and preparation of the video clip was so at odds with the frenzied and brutal way the killing itself had been effected. "Also," Berman continued, "all the scenes from the clip are from quite late on in Grace's ordeal. It's possible he only started filming it near the end." Carrigan nodded, thinking this over. Which makes you wonder, did he plan this all along? Or did something happen while he was torturing Grace that caused him to take out his phone and film it? "Are we any closer to finding out where he uploaded it?" "An internet cafe on Queensway, Wednesday afternoon. It's one of those fly-by-night places. I went down there this morning, but they don't have cameras and no one could remember anyone acting suspicious that day." Carrigan hadn't held out much hope, but it had been necessary to check. The problem was, every time a lead came back dead, he could see the disappointment slump his men's faces as they realised it would only get harder from now on. "Sir?" Carrigan turned to see D.C. Singh tapping her fingers impatiently on the table. "Maybe we need to look at this in reverse." "Explain?" Singh's fingers stopped their metronomic drumbeat. "We are assuming he killed Grace and made the video as a souvenir. But what if it's the other way round?" She paused, watching the others take this in. What if the video is the point? What if he killed Grace expressly so that he could video it? Carrigan hadn't expected this from the usually demure DC. "You're talking about a snuff film?" "It's worth a look, right?" Singh replied. Carrigan scratched his beard. It's a good point, but I don't think it's going to help us find this man.
If it is something to do with snuff films, then our best lead is still going to be focusing on the physical evidence. The why won't tell us where he is. He hadn't wanted to knock Singh down, was pleased at her initiative, but delving into alternative theories wasn't going to help anyone now. The super had made that abundantly clear earlier in their meeting. Branch had seemed to know a lot about the details of the investigation, details Carrigan hadn't supplied in his report. He looked around the room, hearing muffled shouts coming from Branch's office. "Anyone know where D.S. Miller is?"
"Pursuing a lead."
Carlson smiled, teeth perfect as a dentist's poster. Carrigan stared at his sergeant, knowing something had shifted in the dynamics of the team, something subtle yet fundamental. A week ago, he would have said he didn't care, that the job had lost whatever promise it had once held out to him. But now, enmeshed in this case, unsure of his team's loyalties, he found with surprise that things had changed. "I didn't see anything noted in the action book." Carlson shrugged. "That's probably because she thought you'd shut her theory down if she told you about it." "Her theory? Is that what it is?" Carrigan replied, annoyed at himself for rising to Carlson's bait, yet helpless to ignore it. "She thought you weren't taking her seriously enough." "Any problem I might have with D.S. Miller is none of your business. It makes me wonder if you really want to solve this case, Sergeant." Carlson glared up from his mug. "Perhaps you should be asking yourself the same question." Silence filled the room. Carrigan stared at Carlson, not sure where to take this or how far. Then Berman broke the silence. "Just spoke to someone at London Transport. Miller asked me to trace Grace's movements through her Oyster card," he explained. "Yes?" Carrigan said impatiently. "There was nothing unusual except that she made regular trips at least once a week to Willesden Green." Willesden Green? Carrigan racked his brain, trying to think of a connection. What was there for Grace in Willesden? Neither Cecilia nor Gabriel lived anywhere near there, nor anyone else connected to the case. "Good work. Get some uniforms to show the photos, see if anyone remembers her. We should look at the possibility that she had a secret boyfriend there, and—" He paused, watching the uniforms scribbling notes, faces clenched in tight concentration. "And find out where Professor Cummings lives." He felt relieved to leave the incident room, but when he passed Branch's office, things only got worse.
"Carrigan, a moment, please."
The super's face was red and spotted, his glasses smudged, his tie askew. Carrigan had little choice but to follow him in. The two men in dark blue suits he'd glimpsed earlier were standing in Branch's office. Both looked hot and impatient. They watched Carrigan carefully as he entered and took a seat.
"Just the person I wanted to see."
Branch smiled genially. Carrigan knew from experience that this was a bad sign.
"This is D.I. Carrigan,"
Branch explained.
"He's leading the investigation."
He turned back to Carrigan and shrugged.
"The Ugandan embassy is very interested in our progress. I told them that we're close to finding out who did this. I wasn't wrong, was I?"
Carrigan stared at the men. Was there something in their gathered shape, standing side by side, that reminded him of the two men in the car outside his flat last night? Or was he suddenly noticing African faces the way he had on coming back 20 years ago?
"A couple of days should wrap it up,"
he replied through gritted teeth.
"Good. Good. We know how expert the British police is in these matters,"
the bureaucrat in charge said, shaking Carrigan's hand, his grip firm and unyielding.
"So, Inspector, I'm sure you have your suspects.
and your theories.
We have several, Carrigan replied. But it looks like a sex killing. Someone who knew her or was at least familiar with her. The bureaucrat nodded slowly, as if processing this information.
Then, why, Inspector? If that is indeed so, are you looking into ancient history?
Carrigan shot Branch a look. I don't know what you're talking about. The Ugandan shook his head.
We know that your partner, the female detective...
D.S. Miller, Branch filled in immediately.
Yes, Miller,
the Ugandan said, still gripping Jack's hand tightly.
We know that she's looking into things no one wants to look into. Things that have nothing to do with this case.
Ancient history, Carrigan said, the Ugandan missing the sarcasm in his voice.
That is so, the man replied, and no one is interested in history. I know you will find out who did this to one of our citizens, and I thank you.
His hand finally unclenched from Carrigan's, Jack having to rub the feeling back into his flesh.
These monsters who take a woman and do to her what they please, there is only one punishment for them.
Carrigan marched out of the office not looking back, and he was almost out of the station when his phone rang. He checked the display, but it was only telling him he had 2 messages. He pressed a button, and Ben's voice, thin and strained, crackled through his headset.
I need to see you. Penny's gone, Jack. Someone took her from football practice at school.
He never got round to listening to the second message. Carrigan drove through the darkening city, oblivious to the swirling world around him. The sound of Ben's voice ringing in his head. He tried not to think about it. There was nothing he could do until he got there, and he ran through the last hour again, still unsure of its implications. The Ugandans had known a lot about the investigation. He remembered the phone call to the embassy, the junior diplomat who had been about to tell him something, then stopped. What had he seen? He crossed the Great West Road and watched with envy the cars streaming through the twilight like illuminated candy. The spiralling lights announced themselves before he'd turned the corner, and instantly something in his blood perked and simmered. Every time he heard a siren, he wondered what new evil had occurred. There were never neutral lights flashing mysteriously in the night, always blood, bodies and broken lives. But he wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted him as he turned into Ben's street and saw the parked cars, lights flashing, the Socko van, the sense of hurried concentration on the uniformed men's faces. He flashed his warrant card and rushed past them. Ben's door was swinging open, the stained glass panel with its retinue of gold-bedecked angels dazzling in the late sinking sun. He found Ben talking to a Chiswick CID inspector in the main room, his tone flat and unruffled, his eyes quickly acknowledging Jack.
Thanks for arriving so quickly.
They came together in a semi-hug, Carrigan smelling the whiskey on Ben's breath, and below that a sour tang of sweat. He looked to his right and saw Ursula holding Penny in her arms, the little girl crying and shaking as a family liaison officer tried calming mother and daughter down. When did she come back?
Someone dropped her off at the end of the street a few minutes ago.
Ben replied, his hand still shaking, his eyes continually looking in Penny's direction as if to assure himself she was still there. Is she all right? Ben stared across the room at his daughter.
I think so. I'm not sure. I don't know, Jack. Jesus, look at her.
The girl was crying, shielding herself from the group of policemen gathered around her. A sergeant was trying to ask her some questions. Ben grabbed Jack's arm.
Let's go upstairs.
Ben led him into the study, the smell of cigars and whiskey heavy and dolorous. They sat down, and Jack poured them both drinks. "Did she see who took her?" Ben stared out the window.
No, not really. He picked her up from the school. Said we'd sent him. Somehow convinced the coach.
Ben looked down at his hands and shook his head.
She got into the car with him. Jesus Christ.
Jack passed him the drink, watched as Ben downed it in one.
He just drove her around for a few hours, then dropped her off. She said he was African. Why did he want her, Jack? What the fuck did he do to my daughter?
I don't know, Jack admitted. I don't understand it myself. I'm sure the inspector downstairs will find out. He could see that Ben was barely hearing him, his eyes bright with fear and worry. You didn't, by any chance, get a look at the material I gave you? Grace Okello's thesis. Ben nodded slowly, his feet tapping the floor, the adrenaline rush of a near miss coursing through his veins.
I saw the YouTube clip. Jesus, the things they did to her.
He looked up from his glass, sympathy draining the years from his face.
This is your life, isn't it? Murder. Distraught parents who think they're never going to see their kids again. I never really thought about it before. The shit you have to go through every day.
Jack sat back down and cradled his glass. Was there anything in the thesis? Anything that might have got her killed? Ben slid forward on the chair, propping his thin elbows on the table.
This Okello woman was looking into things that no one once exhumed. Not the government and not the bad guys. But, to go back to your question, I don't think it's very likely. The thesis hadn't yet been published. Most of it's in the form of notes. There's no accountable chain of evidence for her conclusions. You really think that someone killed her because of it?
Carrigan stared into his best friend's eyes, knowing he couldn't put it off any longer. I think the Ugandan embassy may be involved in some way. I keep thinking we're getting closer, and then I realise we're only seeing a small fraction of the whole, he continued, not sure how to break the news. And whenever I get a sense that I'm being followed during a case, I get hinky. I start wondering about things.
Someone's following you.
He heard the concern in Ben's voice that the missing years hadn't managed to revoke, remembered their shared oaths of loyalty to each other. David's smile when they all agreed never to forget those days. He told him about the envelope in his flat, the pictures of him and Ben, the pictures of the girls. He watched Ben's eyes hood and turn dark as he assimilated the information. He watched Ben slowly pour himself a large measure of whiskey.
Photos of my girls,
Ben said, trying to stop his bottom lip from twitching. Carrigan nodded, knowing he could never understand the fear and panic of a parent, that he'd always be the one giving the news rather than receiving it. I think he's been following me since the first morning, he added, looking down at the floor. He saw me coming here the night I gave you the thesis. He took the photos then. Something in Ben's expression changed, as if a switch had been flicked.
Are you saying you led this man here?
His voice had taken on an inflexible authority that Jack had previously only heard him use on hapless students.
Fuck. Is this the man who took Penny? Is this what you're talking about?
Carrigan thought of Cecilia and Gabriel, Geneva alone out on the streets. Maybe, he admitted.
Jesus fucking Christ!
Ben suddenly exploded, fear blushing his face a deep scarlet.
You put my family in danger.
Carrigan saw the whole scenario click itself into place in Ben's head. The sudden thickening of life into something more than missed engagements and petty arguments. Ben reached across the table and gripped Jack's wrist. His face was white, the muscles jumping below the skin.
What the fuck does this man want with my family?
Carrigan shrugged, and Ben tightened his grip.
Jack, fucking tell me.
I don't know. I really don't, Ben, he answered, seeing his friend's face drain and collapse. It was easy to forget the everyday fear that cops had to become inured to. Easy to forget not everyone lived their lives like that. It could be he's trying to scare me off the case. He watched Ben's face fall. Full marks for putting the victim at ease, Carrigan sourly thought. You keep the shotgun here or at your parents' house in Dorset? Ben's eyes widened, then squinted down to two small blue stones.
Yeah,
he said so quietly that Carrigan almost missed it. As a policeman, they'd sack me for telling you this. But as a friend, I'd advise you to keep it handy until all this is over. Ben hung his head, clenched his fists, and ground his feet into the floor.
This is because you gave me the fucking dead girl's thesis. That's what this is all about.
He got up without waiting for an answer, strode over to his desk, and started throwing papers and pamphlets onto the floor until he found what he was looking for. He walked back over to Jack and threw the copy of Grace's thesis into his lap.
Fucking keep it, he snarled. Don't get me involved again.
Carrigan walked along the river for half an hour, not noticing the people strolling past, the sunset, or the boats slowly moving up the silty water. He got to the bridge where his childhood friend had leapt from, his body lost in the current, and went into a newsagent where he bought 10 camels and a lighter. He stood by the river and smoked his first cigarette in a year, coughing and choking on the acrid smoke, and then he flung the rest of the pack into the grey water. He watched as it was pulled and pushed by the current. When his phone beeped, he felt an unexpected rush of excitement, hoping it was Geneva. But it was only a reminder that he still had one unchecked message. I need to see you. He recognised Cecilia's voice immediately, except that the panic and fear had drowned out everything but the words themselves. I didn't tell you everything when you interviewed me. I'm so sorry. Chapter 19. The storms came more often now. Raging, bruised thunderheads approaching from the east of the city and breaking upon its streets as people scuttled home on the tube or flagged down a bus, its windows steamed with condensation and finger smear. Carrigan stood under a low bridge of the Regent's Park Canal, suspended 10 feet below the city streets, trying to get out of the worst of the rain. He felt like a bit-part character in a bad late-night film, the one who always gets killed a third of the way through. Joggers ran past him, their faces staring into the distance, oblivious of all around them, their sneakered feet beating out a rhythm on the concrete embankment. The pleasure boats and guided taxis were mostly gone for the day, the residents of the numerous houseboats all battened down and behind closed shades. Ducks sailed by, gleaming like wooden toys. Leaves twisted and fluttered and gathered at his feet. Some days the Regent's Park Canal could look like Amsterdam. Some days Venice, if you squinted hard enough. But today it looked like something from another century. A world of coal-laden tugboats slowly inching their way up the water, bedraggled mules pulling them along, a ghost of London past shimmering out of the drizzle and then just as quickly dissolving. Carrigan thought of the lost and hidden rivers of the capital,
the Effra Brook, the Fleet, the Tyburn, the Neckinger, and the Walbrook. This other city humming beneath his feet. Stand still long enough, and you could hear it through the soles of your shoes. He watched the rain sluice across the grey-green canal water and checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. She was almost an hour late. He started at every noise, every crackle of foliage or hum of rail. The scream of macaws and other exotic birds from the nearby zoo made him feel uneasy with unbidden memories. He was checking his watch again when he saw a figure approach from the other end of the tunnel. She stopped halfway, a dark, shrouded thing suspended in the middle distance. He stood still, didn't make any sudden moves. He watched her head turn one way then another, as if she had heard some unexpected noise behind her. She looked back one last time, then continued walking. They stood there for a moment, under the dark shadow of the railway bridge, both unsure what to do as a lone canal boat glided silently across the water. Cecilia ducked behind a stanchion as it went past. "I'm glad you called me," Carrigan said. Cecilia looked like a bad photocopy of the girl they'd interviewed only a few days ago. The spark and flare drained out of her. She glanced to either side of him, then down at the floor. "He's been following me all this time. I had to leave the flat, stay over at a friend's after I saw the video." Her eyes darted like trapped things, her voice trembling in the cold air. Carrigan stepped closer and gently took her by the arm. "It's okay now. I'm here." She nodded, and, for a moment, Carrigan saw something else beneath the granite grimace and hunted eyes. A young girl who had found herself locked in the attitude and bearing of a person she never thought she'd be. "What happened, Cecilia?" She was staring up at the cross-hatched girder-work on the underside of the bridge, as if the metal and brass were a language only she could decipher. A train rumbled overhead, causing her to flinch. "I'm sorry. Maybe this was a bad idea. If he sees me, if he followed me." "Who? Gabriel? Gabriel Otto?" Something crossed Cecilia's face, and then it was gone like sunlight hitting water. She managed a small, dry chuckle. "Gabriel's an idiot." "He struck me as somewhat more than that when we interviewed him." Cecilia looked momentarily confused. "You arrested Gabriel for—" She couldn't say it. Didn't want the words to come out of her mouth and seal this thing in truth. "We're looking into it." A noise in the bushes caused them both to turn, fall into silence. But it was nothing, just squirrels or the wind upsetting the litter. "Why did you laugh when I mentioned Gabriel?" Cecilia stared at the bushes. "Gabriel's a fool. Just a spoiled kid playing grown-up games. He's not capable of such a thing." "How can you be so certain?" "People who spend all their time talking about violence and struggle are normally the last to take up arms." He wasn't sure how good a defence that would be in court, but something about it rang true. Grace never took him seriously. And that didn't upset him. For the first time, Cecilia laughed unguardedly. It sounded like another girl, one who was carefree and content, whose life had never hiccuped, never grown thick with death. "Gabriel just goes on to the next one. He doesn't care." Carrigan flashed back to the pale-skinned woman wrapped up in Gabriel's sheets, the dead-eyed look on the young man's face. Grace told Gabriel she was seeing a source. He said she seemed very excited about it. Shit. It was the first time he'd heard her swear. "I told her not to meet him," she finally said. "I knew he was wrong from the minute I laid eyes on him."
Carrigan took a deep breath to steady himself. The canal water tilted, and the screaming of jungle birds carried like the cries of abandoned infants. "Who are you talking about, Cecilia?" She looked across the water.
"I saw him outside my flat after you two had left that day. Just standing there, staring at me."
Carrigan clutched her arm, felt the blood and tension simmering inside.
"Why didn't you tell us any of this before?"
He tried to smooth the frustration out of his voice, but he could tell from the girl's face that it wasn't working.
"I was scared," she replied. "I thought if I didn't speak of him, he wouldn't come back. I'd just heard about Grace. I was so confused that day."
"But it was because of him you missed your meeting with Professor Cummings and haven't gone back to SOAS?" Cecilia nodded. "How did Grace meet this man?"
"As I told you before, Grace had become obsessed by her work, spending day and night in the library reading every book there was on East African history and politics. But what she really wanted was first-hand accounts. She used Gabriel to make contact with several émigrés, but she didn't find anyone who knew what she needed or who was willing to talk. She started posting messages asking for information on this Ugandan chat forum we use to catch up with what's going on back home."
Carrigan could feel the creeping cold against his skin, the biting canal wind whipping through the trees, the sense of time speeding up like on a fairground ride. "What kind of messages?"
"She wanted to get in touch with ex-child soldiers from Ngomo's army."
He breathed deep, stared at the water. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. "Did anyone get back to her?"
"She had a lot of replies, but mainly she deleted them, saying it was the wrong part of the country or the wrong years. But there was one reply a few weeks ago that got her excited. I remember because we were both sitting in the library when she received it. She turned to me and said, 'This one's dates match.' She kept rereading the email, saying how she had finally made a breakthrough. I tried to warn her, tell her that she didn't know who had sent this, what their reasons were, but she just called me paranoid. She wrote back and said she was very interested in meeting him. I told her I'd accompany her, but she didn't want me to. We had our first real argument over that. She said this was a very sensitive thing, that if I turned up, it might spook her one and only chance at finding out the truth. At least I persuaded her to make the first meeting at the university cafeteria."
"It sounds like she was after a particular bit of information. Do you know what it was?"
"No. She never spoke about her thesis, even to me. It was her little secret, she used to say."
Carrigan stood absolutely still, the rain soaking through his coat and plastering his shirt to his skin. He'd so quickly dismissed Geneva's theory about a connection between Grace's work and her murder. He couldn't tell if it was because the evidence hadn't pointed to that conclusion, or because he'd suspected that Branch had fed her the story to discredit him.
"I followed her,"
Cecilia continued, her voice drawn and tired.
"I'd waited until she left class that morning, and I could tell from her mood, her expression, that she was going to meet this source."
Carrigan suddenly leant forward, startling Cecilia. "Did you say source? Was that the word Grace used?"
"She called him her source. I thought she was being overly dramatic, like this was Watergate or something."
"Did the man turn up?"
"Right on time. He approached her table. Grace got up, they shook hands, exchanged greetings, and then both sat down. I couldn't hear what they were saying. There was some kind of birthday party going on, loud music. But they were talking heatedly, friendly but fast. It seemed like they were getting on well." Carrigan felt his heart beat in his chest, the slow fade and pulse of his own life.
What did this man look like?
Actually, under 20, definitely. Maybe only 17 or 18. The moment I saw him, I knew he was wrong. There was something about him. Those eyes. Everyone from my country has seen that stare before. There was nothing there. Like a ghost. He had short dreads and wore an orange t-shirt and torn jeans. I sat there hoping, wishing that Grace would send something too, and I'd see her get up, say thank you, and walk off into the rest of her life.
But she kept talking to him.
For half an hour at least. Then, at the end, something strange happened.
Cecilia looked around at the empty towpath.
This man. He reached his hand out across the table and Grace took it. She held his hand in hers, and that's when...
She looked away, snared by some sound.
That was when he saw me. He held Grace's hand and stared directly into my eyes, and it was like he was judging me right there and then, and he'd found me wanting. But that wasn't the worst thing.
Carrigan saw Cecilia shudder as she stared down at her feet.
The worst thing was when he smiled. His teeth. They were sharp, pointed, like the teeth of a vampire.
Chapter 20. The bar was dark and dingy, the way bars were in his memory. But this was just the doldrums of a Sunday afternoon. There was only one occupied table, 4 male students drunk already, their voices rising with each sip of their beers. Carrigan walked over to the bar and stood there for a couple of minutes as the barman resolutely ignored him, chatting on a mobile phone and stacking bottled ales. Carrigan was glad for the pause. It gave him time to think, to clear his head, which was still reeling from Cecilia's revelation. The music screamed with wailing guitars. The smell of old beer and chips hung in the dull air. He remembered another student bar, very much like this one. The 3 of them sitting around a table like conspirators, degrees in pockets, planning their trip to Africa. He felt a sharp pain rattle through his chest. He missed David so much, and all these years of pretending he didn't, of trying to carve out a new life for himself, made the pain all that much more acute now.
What can I get you?
The barman looked at Carrigan with barely concealed antipathy. He was tall and wore long blonde dreadlocks slung across his shoulder like a lion's mane. His T-shirt declared "Capitalism is dead," and his face was decorated with hoops and piercings, tattooed barcodes, and silver rings. Carrigan pulled out his warrant card, watching the barman's eyes turn narrow and guarded when he saw what it was. The music got louder. Carrigan sure the barman had just raised the volume. His ears began to ring, a high-pitched whine that was a constant reminder of Africa.
"Can you turn it down, please?"
The barman looked up from his chores.
"Listen, old man."
His accent was pure Notting Hill, public schools and Sunday afternoon cricket matches.
"If it's too loud for you, you can always leave."
Carrigan bit his lip, turned and walked over to the jukebox. The drunks stared up from their pints as he took the cable and wrenched the plug out of the wall with one quick snap of his wrist. The music died mid-song. The students shot him dirty looks, but, drunk as they were, even they could see the tightness in his features, the thinness of his lips, and decided that actually no music was fine by them. Carrigan reached the bar and placed both his arms across the wooden surface. "What's your name?"
"Flash."
"That's what you use to clean the toilet with. What's your real name?" Flash looked left and right, then whispered,
"Tarquin."
So quietly Carrigan barely caught it. Carrigan snorted. "I think I prefer Flash."
There was a birthday party here 2 weeks ago, Friday the 17th. I need to get in touch with whoever was organising it. The barman tossed back his mane of hair and looked down at the scratched surface of the bar.
Can't remember,
he replied, turning his back to Carrigan, and started stacking bottles again. Carrigan laid Grace's photo flat on the bar.
How about her?
She was here that Friday.
I don't suppose you remember serving her?
Flash turned back and glared at Carrigan. He picked something out of his teeth with a long, curved fingernail. Carrigan could smell the man now. Unwashed clothes, stale smoke, and something else far less pleasant underneath.
What? You expect I'm some fucking memory man? Flash replied. You know how many people come here on a Friday night?
But a big birthday party? Lots of tips? You'd remember that, surely. Carrigan could feel the moment slipping. He'd come here flushed with hope that Cecilia's statement would be the break they'd been waiting, praying for. But now he realised he'd been as foolish as his most callow constable. I do my job, serve up the drinks. Anything else? Not my concern. Flash turned back to the refrigerators and continued stacking.
Come here,
Carrigan said, his voice thick with authority. Flash slowly turned and shuffled up to the bar. Carrigan reached forward and grabbed the young man by one of his long dreadlocks. He immediately regretted it, the hank of hair greasy and sticky in his grip, revulsion crawling up his throat, but he held on. You know, cops have this extra sense thing, he said, twisting the young man's hair, like a sixth sense, like how I can see your future by just looking into your eyes. Flash struggled against Carrigan's grip, but there was nothing he could do. Yeah? Yeah, Carrigan replied. And guess what? I see you with short hair, a suit, and a blackberry in your hand, a nice blonde wife from Hampshire, and a flat in Limehouse close to your office in the city. Something in Flash's eyes recoiled, as if he'd inadvertently caught a glimpse of his true self in a passing mirror. Serving people. That's what you do, isn't it? Must be hard these days, Carrigan continued, changing the subject. What with girls looking much older than they actually are, would be easy to make a simple mistake, serve someone underage, get yourself into a lot of trouble. He let go of Flash's hair and wiped his hand on his trousers, registering the barman's eyes, the way they widened then shut down. Now, you wouldn't want me sending in uniforms on a regular basis, making ID checks, would you? Might drive some of your customers away, having the police in here all the time. Flash's face blanched. He tried to hide it, but it was no good. What do you want? He said, under his breath. Carrigan pointed up at the CCTV camera. How long do you keep the security tapes before you recycle them? The barman smiled. Wiped every week, he replied with great satisfaction. Carrigan held his jaw rigid, tried not to let the disappointment show. But you do remember the birthday party, right? The barman shrugged. What? Someone snuck a fag? You're here to solve the mystery of the missing Marlborough? No, Carrigan calmly replied, pointing to the photo of Grace. This girl was murdered last week, and we believe she met her killer here. The barman stopped what he was doing, stared at Carrigan as if suspecting this was some kind of joke, then picked up the photo and studied it. I know the day you're talking about, but I wasn't lying when I said I couldn't remember her. Carrigan nodded. You don't happen to know the name of the person whose birthday it was? Flash put the photo back down, actually thought about this for a second or two. Afraid not. Some girl, that's all I know. Shit! Carrigan slammed his fist down against the bar, making Flash jump as if he'd been on the receiving end of an electric shock. Carrigan looked down at the photo of Grace, silently mouthing an apology, and started to gather up his things. But you should check Facebook, Flash said. Carrigan looked up. What? Facebook?
You know what that is, old man? He smiled, revealing teeth yellow as corn husks. Carrigan nodded, though he'd never actually been on the site himself and had no real idea what its purpose was. They posted all the photos there, sent us a link. There'll be the name of the lucky girl at the top of the page. But it wasn't her name that Carrigan was interested in anymore, as he waited for the surly barman to copy the address off his laptop. He rushed into the incident room, his jacket all rumpled, hair messed up by the wind and rain. "Sir?" DC Singh raised her head from her desk, flicked back her hair. "I was just wondering—" "Not now." Carrigan cut her off, marched past Berman and Jennings and entered his office. He'd left the window open, and 1/4 of the room was covered in rainwater. He put his coffee down on the table, the smell making him feel human again. He could see the others staring through the glass partition, wondering what was up, but he ignored them, booted up his computer, and sat there, feet tapping, his fingers unable to sit still as he waited. He took a sip of the coffee, restraining himself, wanting to make it last, and thought about David again. The student bar bringing back sour memories, and then, when his browser was ready, he typed in the Facebook link that Flash had given him. He thought it would be simple. He thought it would be easy. He thought all he needed to do was type in the address and he'd find what he was looking for. But first he had to sign up. There was a box on the right-hand side of the screen asking for his personal details. He typed slowly. Name, username, password, confirm password, then clicked. The screen refreshed, but it was the same screen. He stared at it, frustrated, not sure what he'd done wrong. His password was highlighted in red. He must have typed it differently the second time. He corrected the mistake and pressed enter. Nothing. The screen refreshed and told him there was something wrong with his fields. He shook his head, ground his feet into the floor, and re-entered all the information from scratch. This time, the site accepted his registration, but just as the new page was loading, the browser crashed. He refreshed it and entered his details for the 4th time, watched as a new page unscrolled in front of him. There were so many options, so many boxes to fill, and what the hell was a profile anyway? He tried entering the address he had been given, but the site kept demanding he create a profile first. He started filling out the form, ran out of time, the page refreshed, and he lost all the data he'd inputted. Shit! He punched the keyboard in frustration, catching the end of his coffee cup and sending it flying across the desk, covering the computer in thick, sweet liquid. He cursed, reached into his drawers for some tissues, and tried to soak up the worst of the mess, but it seemed to just make it spread faster, and there was now an acrid burning smell coming from his hard drive. He got up, brushed the coffee off his trousers, and stuck his head through the door. "Berman!" he shouted, watching as the constables snapped their heads up, then quickly backed down when they registered his expression. Berman got onto the site in less than a minute. Carrigan stood behind him, taking deep breaths, telling himself this was probably nothing, another dead end, no reason to get too excited. "You, know how Facebook works?" Berman looked up from the screen. "Don't know and don't care," Carrigan replied. "Just see if they've posted photos of the birthday party." Berman nodded, his left hand shooting down and worrying the ends of his prayer shawl. His other hand skimmed across the keyboard, clicking furiously. 244 of them. Jesus! Carrigan shook his head. "Digital cameras," Berman replied. "People just snap away, doesn't matter what they're snapping." A bit like mobile phones and Twitter, Carrigan thought. People talking just for the sake of talking. Yet it was this very randomness he was pinning his hopes on. He watched as Berman clicked and a new window opened, a prompt asking whether they wanted to see the pictures individually or as a slideshow. "One by one and slowly," Carrigan said, pulling up a chair and taking a seat next to Berman. Berman clicked photo after photo. The birthday girl was blonde and lovely. Carrigan felt something in him ache. She reminded him of Louise the first time they'd met, across an interview table, her beauty untarnished by the client she represented, her voice the only thing he could hear that day. Most of the photos were blurry, indistinct, people smeared in bouts of movement or shot in such close-up all he could see was bad skin and gleaming teeth. They looked so young, these students, so unencumbered by life. Berman quickly flicked through a set taken at the birthday table, endless bottles of wine and half-filled glasses surrounding the group. "Faster," Carrigan ordered, tapping his foot impatient, wondering whether this was all another crazy waste of time, when he suddenly grabbed Berman's arm and said, "Stop." There she was, Grace, sitting at a table, a huge smile on her face, caught in the margins of the photo. Carrigan felt his heart speed up, saw that Berman was now staring at the screen with a new concentration. They both looked at the shadowed form of the man's back, the man sitting opposite Grace. Her killer. The party had started to break up, and the photographer was now moving around the room. Berman flicked through the next sequence, but there was nothing but smiles, misty eyes, and raised toasts. Then he stopped, staring at the screen, holding his breath. Carrigan pushed his chair forward and leant across Berman. Oh my God. They were staring at a photo of the birthday girl. She was standing to the right of the frame, holding a bottle of champagne and the waist of a young man. But it wasn't that which drew the two detectives' eyes. It was the background. They could see the back of Grace's head, her luxurious bounty of hair, one hand raised in the middle of some unknowable gesture. Across from her sat a young black male, his face illuminated by the camera flash. "Can we get this any bigger?" Berman clicked some keys, and the picture opened up in a new browser window. He clicked and panned until the man's face was at the centre of the photo. Carrigan blinked twice as he finally stared into the killer's face. He looked so young, terribly young, that at first Carrigan felt a slight disappointment. There was something about his eyes. The more you looked at them, the more they seemed to be looking at you. As he stared at the image of Grace's killer, he saw the eyes which had stared back at him that first day outside King's Court. Part 2. Back then, time began to move in strange currents, simultaneously speeding up and slowing down as Jack opened the car door and saw the soldiers' guns shaking in their drunken hands, the flare of birds tearing the night sky above them. They'd been told about these sudden roadblocks, hushed voices in their Kampala hotel relating stories of miraculous escapes, ugly situations, diffused with a timely joke. He hoped this was all it was, another all-purpose story to reel out at future dinner parties. "Passports!" The lieutenant was younger than them, but the oldest of his group. He looked barely past puberty. He gestured with his rifle and watched as Ben and David got out of the car and took their place next to Jack in the clearing. The other soldiers stood by the roadblock, passing a bottle of murky liquid among themselves and laughing, their voices echoing through the jungle night.
"It'll be okay,"
Ben whispered as he handed his passport to the lieutenant. Jack saw David mumbling to himself, his head hanging down and the small blue book fluttering in his hands as if it were some rare butterfly longing for the sky. The lieutenant flicked through their passports, pressing his face close to the pages as if this would divine the truth of these items. When he got to Ben's and saw the folded money, he paused, and Jack held his breath, watching the lieutenant's eyes look up and find Ben. "You must think we are animals," he said, his voice surprisingly soft and melodic. Before Ben could reply, the lieutenant turned to his men and barked an order, and suddenly they were inside the car, going through their stuff, throwing things out onto the dark, muddy track. "We were trying to get to Murchison Falls," Jack explained, the moment contracting and pulsing, a strange feeling like slipping out of time, his head rattling with possible outcomes, every click and cough magnified. The lieutenant smiled, revealing a mouth totally barren of teeth, pink as a baby's fist. "This is restricted territory," he replied curtly, his eyes scanning the interior of the car like a pair of searchlights. "But the guidebook said the park was open." The lieutenant looked at Jack.
"How can a book know the truth of the world?"
He seemed genuinely perplexed. Jack was about to reply when one of the soldiers handed the lieutenant something he'd found in the car. He took it, nodded, and looked it over. Jack felt his heart skip as he recognised his own notebook.
"What's this?"
The lieutenant waved it around, as if it were too hot to hold. "It's my notebook. I write songs in it?" Jack's voice quivered, and he felt Ben's hand light reassuringly on the back of his arm. The lieutenant flicked through the pages of melodies and themes, bass clefs and crotchets. He shook his head, then looked back up at them.
"If that is so, then why is it written in code?"
The truck crashed against the dirt road, sending dust and small stones into their faces and hair. They were handcuffed to a pole at the back of the truck's open bed. They were facing away from each other, keeping their eyes closed against the wind and grit. The truck lurched and span, and Jack couldn't hold it any longer, puking over his own clothes, the fear and nausea drowning his lungs. He hung his head and concentrated on the rusty, flaked bed of the truck, but all he could hear was a strange, breathless burble of words. And then he realised it was David, his voice cracked and faltering, the Lord's Prayer coming out of his mouth and, just as quickly, disappearing in the wind and jungle screams. "Stop fucking praying!" Jack snapped. "You're freaking me out!" "What is going to happen?" The panic in David's voice made Jack wish he hadn't interrupted. "What are they going to do to us?" "Nothing," Ben said firmly. "It's just a stupid misunderstanding." He had to raise his voice to be heard above the truck's motor. "They'll take us to their commander, who's bound to be slightly more intelligent, and they'll realise they made a mistake." "What if they don't? What if—"
"Shut up, Jack!" Ben screamed. "Now's not the time!"
Jack turned his head and faced the road, seeing the jungle fly by in their wake, the smear of colours, green and black and blue, like something painted by a lunatic. The room was small and hot and stank of sweat and shit. A one-eyed soldier was sitting behind an old wooden desk going through their papers, passports, toiletries, tickets. He stroked a thin goatee which hung like moss from his chin as he consulted the documents with all the seriousness of a small-town bureaucrat. His eye patch was made of red leather, scuffed and faded like an old cricket ball. He held out the notebook.
"Whose is this?"
His voice was flat and grainy, as if he were wrestling the very words in his mouth. "It's mine," Ben replied, before Jack had a chance to answer. "He's lying." Jack stepped towards the desk. "It's mine. It's got my name on it." He turned and glared at Ben. He wasn't David, didn't need Ben to protect and shield him from the vagaries of the world. The soldier flicked through the book, then put it to one side. "You are a spy." Jack didn't know what to say. For a moment he didn't even understand, and then he did. "We're tourists," he protested. Eye Patch shook his head and wiped sweat from his brow. He held the notebook up, pointing at one of the scrawled pages.
"This is not English. This is code. Only spies use code.
Jack understood how quickly things had changed.
It's musical notation, he replied, and tried to explain what the symbols stood for, then grasped that the soldier had probably never even seen a piano before, let alone written music. It was infuriating trying to explain something so obvious and realising that what you took for granted was not really so. Eyepatch considered this, looking back down at the notebook, flicking through its damp pages, then putting the notebook up against one ear, his face clenched in mock concentration.
Music? This is not music.
Jack watched as Ben and David were quickly surrounded. He could feel the air literally stop in his throat, something he'd always thought only a metaphor, and he had to will himself to take another breath. The soldiers took Ben and David, leading them through the door into a corridor shrouded in darkness. David looked back at the last moment, and Jack saw tears running down his face.
Where are you taking them?
Jack screamed, finally letting the rage, frustration and weariness explode through him. Being reasonable hadn't helped. Maybe outrage would.
This is a war,
the soldier stated flatly.
In war, spies must be killed.
It's my notebook!
He felt a thin red thread of panic uncoil in his stomach, like some long-sleeping sea monster finally woken.
Let them go! It's nothing to do with them. You can keep me till we get this sorted out, but please let them go. I told you, we are not spies. It's just fucking ridiculous.
Eyepatch shook his head sadly, as if admonishing a favourite nephew.
And if you were spies, would you not likewise say that you were not?
He paused, looking down at Jack.
You are an intelligent man, yes?
Jack nodded.
Then you must see my problem. How can I tell the true man from the false?
Chapter 21. At least this time she wasn't made to wait. Branch opened the door and ushered her into his office. The room smelt hot and close, cigar smoke and stale male sweat, as if a group of rugby players had only just vacated it. Geneva took shallow breaths through her mouth and sat down. She had been dreading this ever since her first meeting with Branch a week ago. It seemed like much longer, but that was the thing about murder investigations. They existed on their own time frame, and it was all too easy to lose track of the world. Branch was going through a bunch of papers, nodding and shaking his head, aligning them and straightening the edges. She could see her own typed report fluttering in his thick fingers, his eyes going back and forth across the sentences she had had so much difficulty putting together.
So, how are you liking your promotion?
Branch looked up, but he seemed preoccupied, his eyes constantly glancing towards his row of phones. Geneva shuffled on the chair and tried to work out what he wanted from her, what role she should be playing. She knew his innocent question was anything but. "It's good to be back on a major case," she replied. Branch nodded, stared down at the line of mobiles on his table.
"Of course it is."
He pressed a button on one of the phones. "I've read your report," he said, his eyes fixed on the blinking light of the handset.
"A bit thin. I was hoping for something more from you, Miller."
Geneva stared down at her shoes, rubbed the red patch on her wrist. "I didn't feel the need to repeat anything that was already in the daily incident log." Branch's eyes flicked up.
"That's not what I meant."
"I can only report what I've observed."
Of course, but you know very well that's not why I gave you this secondment."
Branch put the report down, all one page of it, picked up another piece of paper and read it briefly. It was handwritten.
She thought she could see her name on it.
"Tell me about Carrigan."
It was the question she dreaded, the only reason she knew that he'd asked her in here for this meeting. She opened her mouth, then closed it, looked up at the photos of blood-soaked boxers. "You asked me to report what I'd seen, and that's what I've done, sir. You didn't ask me to write a psychological profile." Branch stared at her silently, trying to work out whether she was being sarcastic. She could hear the clock behind him ticking off the seconds. She thought about the briefing she was missing and how the next few minutes could affect the rest of her career. "He hasn't done anything wrong that I've observed," she added.
"And you're certain he's following all possible lines of investigation?"
The way he glared at her made her think of the handwritten report she had seen on his desk. The use of that particular phrase, a reminder of an earlier conversation she had had. She wanted to lie to Branch, an unexpected loyalty to Carrigan rising in her. But when she looked up, Branch was slowly shaking his head. "Just tell me, Miller. Don't think I don't know anyway." I'm not sure that he is pursuing all avenues." She felt deflated once the words were out, the sound of them like a shrill cry in her ears. "I don't think he trusts my input. He thinks I'm working for you and that everything I come up with is some ruse to trap him."
Branch looked up. "And why on earth would he think that?"
Geneva let it drop. "It's undermining my attempts to investigate this case properly." Branch squeezed a thin smile through his lips, dropped his reports and nodded.
"Go on. Explain what you mean, Sergeant."
He emphasised the last word, his eyes crinkling behind his glasses. There was no way back now. She had to tell him. She hoped Carrigan would understand. She explained about her research into Grace's thesis, the missing laptop, the way Grace had come back from the Christmas holidays changed, and how her thesis manifested this change by narrowing its focus to General Ngomo. She told him how the ripped-out heart was the General's signature back in Uganda, and how certain she was of these connections. There's too much now for it to just be coincidence. She looked at the clock, felt her confidence returning as Branch listened without interruption. "I think General Ngomo found out that Grace was investigating him and his past deeds and decided she was better off dead." She sat back in the chair and took a deep breath. She didn't know if what she'd just done could be counted as a betrayal of her DI. Carrigan would definitely see it as such, but she'd always believed that the case was more important than any one person's feelings. Branch put a hand up to his head, running his fingers through greying tufts of hair. She could see him digesting the information, his eyes narrowing as facts and theories clicked. He looked up finally, gave her a pleasant smile.
"Nonsense. Absolute nonsense."
Geneva wasn't sure she'd heard him right and leant forward, about to speak, to defend her theory, when Branch cut her off.
"I know you're young and inexperienced, but believe me, you'll find over time that nearly all murders have simple, basic solutions. We'd never even get our clearance rate over 10% if murder was this baroque conspiracy you think it to be."
She'd thought this was what he'd wanted, ammo against Carrigan. But she realised that once again she'd read the situation wrong.
"This is a sex murder, plain and simple, and that's how we're going to work it. I didn't put you on this team to conduct your own investigations, and if you don't like it, then you can go back to being a constable again any time you want."
She rubbed her wrist, the itch maddening, like a burning hole in her arm. "Carrigan put you up to this, didn't he?" she said, before she could lose her nerve. Branch blinked twice, looking genuinely confused.
"Carrigan?
I haven't spoken to him at all. This is about facts, D.S. Miller, and how you read them. I believe you need to go back and look at this again, not waste time on far-fetched speculation. He sighed, picked something up, then put it back down. And besides, we now have a photo ID of our suspect, and I can tell you that he's a lot younger than your general.
She didn't know what to say to that. She stared at Branch, waiting for further disclosure, but he was sitting back in his chair, arms crossed, a smile of smug satisfaction on his face. Geneva managed to nod, keeping her face frozen, not wanting him to read her true expression. "Sir, just one more thing." Glad she'd saved it for last. "Yesterday, I got in touch with the morgue to ask if I could view Grace's body again. She watched the change in Branch's face, the way he'd begun chewing the insides of his cheeks, the drumming of his fingers on the white paper.
And why on earth would you want to do that?"
Geneva smiled for the first time that morning. "I needed to double-check something about the bite wounds. But the funny thing is..." She let it hang there for a moment, enjoying Branch's discomfort. "Myra Bentley told me that they no longer have the body, that it had been claimed. But when I asked her to check the records, she said no one had signed it out." Branch leant forward, puffed out his cheeks. He looked down at his desk and crossed his arms.
"That's correct, Miller. The body has indeed been claimed."
"By whom? Her parents?" Branch shook his head.
"I'm sorry, but I'm not at liberty to tell you that."
"I'm supposed to be working this investigation. Why can't you tell me?" Branch began kneading his fingers, the flesh white and agitated. He leant forward and continued in a whisper,
"I really wish I could, but this isn't my decision."
"So I should talk to the chief superintendent?" She watched his reaction carefully, saw him rising to the bait as she had known he would.
"I'm afraid that won't do much good. Believe me, last thing I wanted was for the body to be released so early, but this goes way above the chief, above the ACC and Commissioner."
"But if it was her family, we need to get in touch with them." If this went higher than the Commissioner, then it must be governmental, Home Office. The ramifications span through her brain, so that she almost didn't catch Branch's last words.
"They'll bollock me to kingdom come for saying this, but..."
He looked down at his row of phones.
"Fuck them. What I can tell you for certain is that it definitely wasn't her family who claimed the body."
He took a deep breath and picked up an unlit cigar.
"To be frank with you, Miller, I'm not sure what's going on here, and it's all way above my pay grade, so the sooner we're shot of this case, the better. We can only come out covered in shit the longer this goes on."
Branch was about to say something else when the door to his office burst open and Carrigan marched in, hair slicked across his face, red-cheeked and breathing heavily. Chapter 22. Branch exploded from the table, the huge mass of him rising out of his seat, sending papers and pencils, old reports, and a half-filled mug of tea flying onto the carpet.
"What the hell do you think you're doing, barging in here like that?"
he screamed, his face turning beet red. Carrigan was about to reply, then felt a shift in air currents, a slight shuffle of feet, and turned to see Geneva sitting in the visitor's chair. He glared at her for a few seconds until she could no longer hold his gaze.
"What's she doing here?"
He stared at Branch, trying to work out what had transpired in the room before he'd come in. Branch sat back down, straightened his shirt, and took a long sip of water. His face returned to its normal ruddy complexion.
"Sit down, Carrigan,"
he said wearily, as if talking to an old and recalcitrant dog.
"I was just about to page you, as it happens." Carrigan took a seat next to Geneva, avoiding her gaze. I can't believe you set up a press conference without consulting me. Branch rubbed his palms together, wiped sweat off his brow with an old folded handkerchief. Last time I looked, I was your superior officer. Perhaps you should reacquaint yourself with the chain of command. I had to learn about this press conference from D.S. Carlson, for Christ's sake. How do you think that makes me look in front of my team? The super smiled and gathered up some loose papers. Since, thanks to your persistence and hard work, we now have a photo of our suspect, I believe it's time to take this public. Carrigan stared at the empty space behind Branch, the towers of glass gleaming in the distance. We don't need a press conference, he said, keeping his voice steady. It'll only make things worse. I don't see how things could get any worse, Branch replied. It's a waste of our time, Carrigan said. We'll be swamped for days with pointless phone calls, jilted lovers or angry business partners wanting to get revenge, everyone who thinks black people all look the same. He looked back to see Geneva staring blankly at the wall, her muscles taut and her lips white as candles. But forget that for a moment. We have a press conference, and if we flash this suspect's photo, we lose our one advantage. He doesn't know we know who he is yet. What do you think will happen once he sees his own face on TV? He'll panic. He'll make mistakes. He'll show up on our radar, Branch replied bluntly, while taking out a stack of clean white paper from his drawer. Not this one, Carrigan said. He's not some amateur that fucked up and is slowly unravelling. Everything we know about him says he'll go further under. He's illegal. He knows bolt holes and hiding places we wouldn't have the first clue about. You put that picture on TV and I guarantee we'll never find him. Carrigan leant back in the chair, out of breath and exhausted, just wanting to leave. Branch began writing something down on a sheet of paper. Are you telling me, Inspector Carrigan, that you're not willing to pursue all lines of investigation? Jack looked at the super, then back at Geneva, who was still silently sitting in her chair. What had she told him? I'm pursuing the most credible leads, he finally replied. The same as I've always done. We've got to look like we're doing something, for God's sake, Branch said. We are doing something. We're following viable leads. Branch shook his head sadly. I said, look like we're doing something. I'm sure you're aware of the difference. This is no longer just about you, Carrigan. I'm getting fucking pressure you wouldn't believe because this fucking video happened to have been filmed on our patch. Branch looked down, concentrating on his papers, scribbling furiously. Do you have anything to say, Miller? Carrigan turned his head, caught Geneva trying to avoid his eyes. I agree with Carrigan, she replied hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I think it'll drive our suspect under. She finally looked at Carrigan, but there was nothing he could read in her expression, and he didn't bother acknowledging her. Branch took off his glasses. The sound of the rain punctuated the silence in the room, each drop like the heartbeat of the world. Well, it's already set up for tomorrow morning. Nothing I can do about it now. There never was anything you could do about it, was there? Carrigan pushed his chair back and stood up. Who's pressuring you? The Ugandans? He glared at Branch, but the super was staring through the window. Why the fuck are they so interested in our case? I wish it was just that, Carrigan, Branch replied. Believe me, this is something I have as little control over as you do. Branch coughed into his hand. I'll see you at the press conference. I'm not doing it. Carrigan's voice was stronger than he'd intended. I'm meeting a DI in Peckham tomorrow following a real lead. I'm not going to fuck that up for a stupid piece of theatre to please your bosses. Branch was smiling now, a thin serpentine smirk that stopped Carrigan in his tracks. Which is exactly why I've asked Detective Miller to stand in for you. Branch finished writing something and evened the pages out, tapping them squarely on the table. Carrigan stared at Geneva, but she looked just as surprised as he was, her eyes blinking fast. He shook his head and left the room without saying another word. Chapter 23. Carrigan read the grease-splattered menu, though he knew every item on it by heart. He'd been coming to this small Chinese restaurant for as many years as he could remember, though Louise had never liked it, preferring one of the trendier establishments up the road. But he liked the dinginess, the steamed-up windows, the waiter who was always popping down the road to the local casino between orders, the tourists put off by the dangling strings of bright orange and yellow intestines hanging in the window, and the cough-racked cook presiding over the soup by the entrance. He nodded over his favourite waiter, a skinny, pock-marked 20-year-old with pale eyes and ferocious weed breath, and ordered a plate of ho fun dry, wonton soup and chili dumplings. His food arrived, and he started feeling better, the familiar wallpaper and unsmiling faces making him feel at home, the closest he ever got anyway. And then he saw her coming in, holding something in her hands, talking to the waiter, his long bony arm pointing towards Carrigan's table. She was the last person he wanted to see right now, so why did he feel a sudden quickening as he saw her approach, unconsciously rubbing his beard free of crumbs, and finally noticing what it was she was holding in her hands? "I thought you might need one." Geneva placed the small coffee cup in front of him. "A triple," she added. "From that place you like." He was about to lay into her, his face tightening, and then he smelt the coffee and all those feelings were quickly washed away. Geneva sat down slowly, still unable to meet his eyes, doing everything she could, sorting through her things, playing with her drink, staring at the unfamiliar, chaotic restaurant. "Jennings told me you'd be here." "Good coffee," he replied, taking a sip, feeling the caffeine kick through his system. "Now tell me what you told Branch." She lay her hands flat, curling up her fingers at the stickiness of the table mat, surprised by his sudden brusqueness, but knowing she deserved it. "I'm so sorry," she said, flustered, squeezed into a corner table, the heat and smell making her dizzy. "I didn't know Branch was going to spring that on you, I swear. I didn't tell him anything that would compromise the investigation." She paused, trying to gauge his reaction, but his face was buried in the menu. "Or that would compromise you." He looked up, thinking about this, and waved her qualms away with his hand. "No need to apologise." He knew he'd been too snappy with her, that she had been played like he had, and that there was nothing to gain by making an enemy out of her. "I should have realised he'd have something like this planned." She took a sip of coffee, wiped her top lip. "He's asked me to do the press conference, but I told him no." Carrigan was impressed by the steel in her voice, the cold gleam of her gaze. "You should do it," he replied. "Don't let my problems with Branch get in the way of your career." She was surprised by his words, searching for hidden meanings or slights, but there were none she could see. "If you don't want me to, nonsense. It'll be good for you to experience what one of those circuses is like. Nothing to be gained by going against Branch." He paused, looking up at the fuzzy TV. "Well, not for you, anyway." "You really think the press conference is a bad idea?" Carrigan put the menu down. "It's not a great one." He called over the waiter with a practised flick of the wrist. "But Branch is half right. I just don't like anyone telling me how to run my investigation, especially as it's my head on the line and not Branch's if this fucks up.
I don't think I realised what I was getting myself into.
A shade of doubt crossed her face, then just as quickly disappeared. I don't think any of us do, ever, he replied. But it seemed to her he was thinking about other things when he said it, his eyes staring up towards the yellow ceiling. You hungry? She nodded. The stress of the day, the smells around her, horrified at the thought that perhaps he could hear her stomach rumbling. Carrigan slid over the menu, but as far as she could see it was written in Cantonese, with no English explanations or useful diagrams. He told her about finding the suspect's photo on Facebook as he jabbed his finger at different entries, saying, "Try this," or "I think you'll love this," until it all began to spin and flicker, and she asked him to order. She watched as he told the waiter what he wanted, the man making quick slashing marks on his white pad. She thought about what had gone on in Branch's office and what she'd found out before that. She knew it was probably the last thing Carrigan wanted to hear.
I know you've dismissed this. I know all that. But I'm convinced that Ngomo is part of this case.
She told him what she'd found out about the General.
It can't be coincidence,
she explained.
Grace is writing a thesis about his crimes, and then we find her murdered with her heart cut out, the same signature Ngomo was notorious for back in Uganda.
She sat back, watching the food, watching Carrigan, expecting him to explode and dismiss her theories with another of those practised brushes of his hand. But instead, his whole body seemed to fall into focus. He pushed his plate aside and laid his arms squarely on the table. This is your theory, right? Not Branch's. She nodded, unfolding one of the napkins, which seemed made out of cheap toilet paper. She dreaded to think what they stocked the toilets with. You've seen what Branch thought of my ideas. Carrigan scratched his beard and took another sip of coffee. It still doesn't make any sense, he said. Grace is writing a thesis that, in all likelihood, only 2 people will ever read. Do you know how improbable it is that Ngomo somehow stumbled on it? I don't think he stumbled on it. I think Gabriel told him. Carrigan looked up. It's still barely a set of coincidences. Circumstantial at best. You're going to give me the nearly all murders are simple and basic spiel? He noticed she was smiling. No, he replied. I assume you're aware of that. But we have a photo of our suspect. What more do you want? An explanation as to how someone like that could get Grace's body released from the morgue. Carrigan stopped what he was doing and put down his cup. She told him how the body had been claimed and how Branch had assured her it had not been family. If Grace's source is everything we think he is, she continued, then there's no way he could have done all this alone. He must be working with someone who has access. We shouldn't rush to a conclusion just because it appears to make sense of things, Carrigan replied, but she could see a subtle shift in his expression, as if he were trying to convince himself of something he knew to be false. He'd filled his mouth with noodles before she could ask him to elaborate, at the same time using his other hand to point out to her a small dish with 3 round dumplings on it. He swallowed his mouthful and used one of the napkins to clean the grease from his beard. The man we have in the photo killed Grace, I'm sure of that. I don't think there's any doubt. But I agree that there's too many loose ends to this case. Things that just don't make sense. She tried picking up the dumpling with her chopsticks, failed miserably, and, humiliatingly, had to ask for a fork. Such as? Carrigan poured them both some dark tea. Why are the Ugandan embassy involved in this case? Why are they pressurising Branch? That's for starters. It's the inconsistencies I'm more worried about. The killer savagely rapes and tortures this girl, yet calmly films it, then edits the clip and uploads it onto the internet. not the behaviour of a compulsive sex killer at all. The computer missing, and yet all of Grace's notes untouched. The ungagging, I'm always coming back to that. Why does he do it? Why put himself at risk like that? Carrigan noisily slurped some soup, put something that looked like a baked dog paw in his mouth. "I don't think this has anything to do with her thesis," he said. "But I agree that there's more to this than we first thought." He told her about the photos left in his flat, Penny's surprise ride home. "I'm being followed, and whoever's doing it is using me to clean up. What scares me is that he's not even trying to hide it." "But if it's more than one man, then we've got to be talking about something in her work," Geneva objected. "Something not only Ngomo but the Ugandan government are desperate to suppress." Carrigan took a long drink of tea and picked at a dumpling, shaking his head. "Crazy to think that writing can get you killed." He'd meant it ironically, but he saw that Geneva had taken him seriously, a shadow darkening her face almost immediately. "Writing is a dangerous business," she replied. He speared another dumpling. "Who said that?" "It's what my mother always used to tell me," she said, finally working up enough courage to go for the entrees. She nearly got killed for her writing. She enjoyed the look of momentary surprise on Carrigan's face. She'd been wondering if someone as undemonstrative as him was even capable of such an emotion. "My mother is Katrina Valenta. You wouldn't have heard of her, but back in Czechoslovakia she was the most popular female poet of the 60s. She was friends with Havel and Dubček and a lot of the other young writers and revolutionaries of the time. She wrote these long, epic poems about freedom and mountains, about Eastern Europe and Lenin's beard. She spent 2 years in a Soviet-controlled prison for dissidents in the Czech woods. She was freed just before '68, the Prague Spring. She quickly got back into the fray and was there at the barricades throwing rocks at the Soviet tanks. But it wasn't for this she had to leave the country in the middle of the night. It was for a short 10-line poem she wrote depicting Stalin as a child abuser and Czechoslovakia as his victim. They issued a warrant for her arrest. Friends of hers helped her get across to Austria. She eventually made it to London, where a lot of Czech dissidents lived. Geneva crunched down on the meat, recoiling at the sound of snapping tendons in her mouth, and continued, "It's not too different from the African diaspora. London's always been a safe place to write, argue and agitate. She continued writing poems, but she was never the same after that. The poems were never the same. Her critics loved the new work, the poems about walking through Highgate Cemetery and sitting by Marx's grave, the sonnets about crossing Europe in cars and buses, but she never thought they were worth anything. She once said to me that the only poems that count are the ones that can get you killed." It was the most he'd heard her talk about her own life, and when he saw the sadness and droop of her eyes, he understood why. Growing up must have been a lot of fun. She stared at him, and for a split second, all the days they'd worked this case were rendered mute. Then she smiled, a thin, grudging smile, and shrugged, as if to say, growing up is never fun. He thought about David. The look in his eyes that day when he saw the man being beaten by the soldiers in Masindi. Their refusal to take a stand, to risk their lives for something they believed in. "She must have been delighted when you joined the Met." "She almost disowned me." She laughed, though Carrigan could tell there were things lurking behind that laugh that weren't so funny. Nights of arguments and slammed doors and words you wish you hadn't said. For a dissident like her, for someone who was always on the run from the police, it was as if I'd gone and joined a cult or become a heroin addict. Much worse, actually. Something crossed Geneva's face and her voice stumbled. "We all have to learn to live with things." "She's learned, but that doesn't stop her sending me neatly clipped job ads from The Guardian at every opportunity." She put down her fork and looked up at Carrigan. "All I wanted to do was prove to my mum that the police were the good guys." Carrigan stared at his plate, something suddenly gone out of him like a popped balloon. "I think I wanted to prove to myself the same thing," he replied, thinking about that road again and the look on David's face as he was being led away. It must have been nice to have always known what you were going to do, though. You can't imagine the shit I went through before I decided. His laugh caught her off guard. There was so little mirth in it. It was the last thing I had in mind. I was a singer once, played some instruments. I made an album. You're kidding. What happened? She remembered D.C. Singh's comment about the wildest rumour she'd ever heard about Jack Carrigan. A look of regret poured into his face, making him almost unrecognisable. Life happened, the way it always does. I used to do that, and now I do this. He wiped his mouth, ran his fingers through his beard and finished his tea. I'm meeting D.I. Spencer in Peckham tomorrow. He's supposed to be an expert, or the closest the Met have got to one, on the African diaspora. He looked up at Geneva, saw her eyes flash blue. I think we're getting close now, he said, his face softening for the briefest of moments. She could feel the sense of excitement and resolution coming off him. You want me to come with you? He shook his head, called over the waiter. We need to find out more about Grace herself. I want you to go back to SOAS. I want to know why she visited Willesden Green so often. Did she have a boyfriend or family there? Someone's bound to know. And I'm uneasy about how little information the university seems to have on her. Talk to the registrar. Lean on them if you need to. But there must be more official documentation. She was under 18 when she started her course. There's got to be a signed consent from somewhere. Application papers, qualification records, references. She nodded, secretly pleased that she would have a chance to go back to SOAS. She watched Carrigan wave her away when she tried to pay. She saw a couple of hapless tourists trying to decipher the menu, being shouted at in Cantonese by one of the waiters, and decided she liked this place. This was nice. Carrigan looked up and smiled. Chapter 24. It was like another country dropped down in the middle of London. A different city existing independently and yet congruent to the larger metropolis. Rye Lane, Peckham, on a Tuesday afternoon. Carrigan had lived in London for over 40 years, and yet he'd never been here. It was one of the things he loved about the city, the way you could turn a corner and fall into another world. But this morning he'd had no time to savour this, nor the way the sun seemed a different shade here, reflecting off the bright multicoloured awnings like something from a lower latitude. He'd seen him again. Carrigan had come out of the train station half an hour early for his meeting with D.I. Spencer. He bought some bad coffee and was staring into the window of a shop advertising African DVDs when he noticed him in the reflection. The man who had been eyeballing him at the AAC meeting. He turned round, but the man was gone. He scanned the pavement, but the faces all blurred. He thought back to the 2 Ugandan diplomats in Branch's office, the men in the car outside his flat, Grace's missing body. He checked his watch, saw that he had enough time, and started walking down the street at a relaxed pace, not looking back. He turned into a small alley, at the end of which he saw the elongated shadows of garages darkly delineated under a railway arch. As he'd expected, behind him he could hear footsteps, a single pair, steady and resolute, getting louder. He felt the blood buzz rush through his head as he walked down the alley, then quickly turned into a sheltering niche reeking of oil and spilt petrol, flattening himself up against the wall. He waited, holding his breath. When his pursuer passed, Carrigan leapt out, grabbed the man's arm and twisted it up against his back. He slammed his own body weight against the man, causing him to crash against the wall. He was pulling out his handcuffs when the man spoke.
Second pocket. Right.
Carrigan held the man's arm up against his back and pulled to tighten the pressure. The man just grunted and tried to ease the strain on his arm. A couple of school kids watched as Carrigan reached in and extracted a thin wallet from the man's pocket. He flipped it open with his teeth and was surprised to see the face of the man he was holding against the wall staring back at him from a police warrant card.
How about my arm?
Carrigan let go, gave D.I. Spencer back his warrant card and apologised. He explained about the man he'd seen following him.
It's 'cause I'm black, right?
Spencer eyeballed him, his face rigid as rock. Carrigan averted his gaze. And then Spencer couldn't hold it any longer and burst out laughing.
Just fucking with you,
he said, big saggy pouches under his eyes as if they held a reservoir of tears he had been unable to cry.
Damn, it was worth it to see your reaction.
He shook his hand vigorously, letting the blood flow back into circulation. You were at the AAC meeting. They stood opposite each other in the small, dank alley. Carrigan felt that peculiar after-effect of adrenaline, the enervation and relief coursing through him. D.I. Spencer straightened his fleece, lit up a cigarette.
I'm looking into them. Part of a case we're working on. When I saw you and your partner, I thought you were going to fuck everything up for us. I wanted to know why you were interested in the AAC, so imagine my surprise when I get this call yesterday from a DI out west who wants to meet. And then when I get here, I see you.
Spencer explained that his team, based in Hackney, were looking into the AAC.
Reports of troublemaking, sending threatening letters, that sort of thing. But what really interests us is how did this Gabriel Otto get his funding? He's just a student, but this is a well-organised and well-financed group.
Spencer finished his B&H and ground it under his size 15 shoe. Well, I'm glad you agreed to meet me, Carrigan said. Spencer laughed, a deep and resonant sound that Jack could feel in his chest.
Couldn't let you come out here all by yourself, they'd eat you alive.
He pointed to two skinny kids standing lookout on a corner.
You don't exactly blend in.
All around him, Carrigan could hear the whirling maelstrom of voices, the hard and soft staccato of Swahili, the languid tones of Luganda, the eerie musicality of Arabic. A mix of accents and intonations that felt as strange and otherworldly as the smells of spices and herbs saturating the damp air. There was a density and concentration of shops and people found nowhere else in the city. Every available surface crammed with a bustle of colour and language. Yet there was also something desperate about this place, and he felt an overwhelming pity for everything. The shops with nothing anyone wanted to buy, the immigrant owners' hopes faded like the once bright signs adorning their storefronts. We headed anywhere in particular? Spencer stopped, lit another cigarette.
There's a house round the back of the high street. A lot of ex-child soldiers doss down there.
Child soldiers?
I've worked up a basic profile of your guy from the info you faxed me yesterday.
Spencer pulled a sheaf of folded papers out of his jacket. Thanks. Carrigan took them, placed them in his own pocket. Give me a quick rundown?
Well, I didn't have too much to go on, Spencer replied. But from the information you gave me, I think your informant is right. The man you're looking for is an Acholi from northern Uganda.
Spencer paused.
Which is bad news in the scheme of things. Not sure this morning's press conference would have helped.
Carrigan mumbled something Spencer didn't catch.
Saw your girl on telly. Looked good, but the whole thing might have scared off your suspect.
Carrigan flashed back to the press conference, the killer's face flickering across millions of TV screens. He'd watched it in a small cafe while eating breakfast. Geneva had looked composed and radiant under the flash pop of camera lights. She stood behind the big Met logo, Branch and the ACC flanking her,
but her eyes were centred on the camera and her voice was steady and calm. She was assured and convincing. Carrigan could tell she'd go far if she would allow herself to. "Wasn't my decision," Carrigan replied, giving Spencer one of those looks that said everything in the curl of an eyebrow.
"Yeah," Spencer replied. "Never is it? Always the people furthest from a case think they know best how to investigate it. Anyway, in all likelihood this man you're after is an ex-child soldier, or ghost soldier, as they're known. From looking over the post-mortem report, I don't think there's any doubt. The level of violence certainly fits. This is a growing problem we're having to deal with. Look."
Spencer pointed through the steamed and grease-rimmed windows of a closed-down Greasy Spoon. Inside, a huddle of men, skinny as spiders, sat crouched around a large table. Their skin shone under the light, their eyes bloodshot, all of them chewing with serene concentration, then spitting out strings of thick green juice. Carrigan remembered the bitter taste of cat that first day in Kampala, the white rush that came after the juices sank into your gums, and then the instant need for more.
They're kidnapped from their homes when they're very young. They're forced to either watch or more often participate in the killing of their own family. Then they're shackled and marched to one of Coney's camps up in the north, taught to fight, beaten and bullied until there's nothing left in them but hate. The girls are taken for use as sex slaves. Your man will not stop, will not listen to reason or compromise. You have to realize this. They come from war, and just because they're in London now doesn't mean anything changes. War is all they know. They are brutalized at such a young age that this is what they've become.
Carrigan shook his head as he stared at the cafe's interior, the lost vacancy in these men's eyes.
Those scars.
Spencer pointed to the photo of Grace's source, the asymmetrical lines carved into the man's face.
They are typical of people who have been fighting in the bush. It's the teeth I'm more worried about.
The teeth?
Some African tribes still use teeth filing as an initiation rite, but not in this part of Uganda. We have heard stories. An elite group of child soldiers, Ungomo's shock troops, survivors of countless bush skirmishes, their teeth filed to resemble the name they chose for themselves, the Wolves. If your man's an ex-wolf, then you've got a big problem.
Spencer led him to a gutted house standing on a corner 2 streets down from the market. A recent fire had painted its facade black and sooty, making it resemble some old Gothic greystone from the 19th century. The windows were missing, and in their place grey Cytex screens had been mounted by the council to prevent squatters. But there was smoke and noise coming from inside, a sense of movement and life. "You sure about this?" Carrigan asked as they climbed the stairs and Spencer prized open the door.
The ones in here are too fucked up to do anything.
But this didn't reassure Carrigan in the slightest as he ducked under the splayed door and into a dark, unlit hallway reeking of sweat, ammonia, and the bright acid tang of burning crack. They entered the main room. The smell and stench of bodies, of toilets that no longer worked, of drug sweat and fear and sex and hopelessness made Carrigan gag. He'd smelt it once before, and his life had never been the same since. On the floor, wherever they looked, prone bodies, thin and delicate as Giacometti sculptures, lay on flattened-out cardboard boxes.
"Give me the photo,"
Spencer said, and Carrigan didn't argue. He knew he was totally out of his element. This was his city, but this was not his city. Not here. He tried to breathe slowly through his mouth, to be invisible, a white man in this room of misery and surrender. He watched as Spencer bent down and gently talked to the few who were still awake or lucid enough to even note his presence.
Carrigan wondered about their homes, their villages, the mornings waking up under the glaring African sky, the endless plains and hunting grounds, and now they were here, poor, bedraggled, and lost in a civilization that didn't understand them and didn't want to. So, like spiders, they found the dark corners, the out-of-the-way places, the waiting rooms where their hours leaked out slowly until there was no difference between death and life. Spencer approached him, grabbing his arm, bringing him back to the present.
I got something.
He led Carrigan to an empty corner.
A few of them definitely recognized him,
he said, handing back the photo of Grace's source.
They looked scared shitless when they saw it. One told me that your suspect used to hang out at the Drill Makers.
What's that?
A nasty pub across from here. Not the kind of place you'd go for a quiet drink.
Carrigan smiled. What are we waiting for? The Drill Makers Arms was once an old-fashioned London pub. That was apparent from the sign hanging loosely at the front, but nothing inside resembled any pub Carrigan had seen since the mid-70s. The heavy plush sofas were ripped and worn and of a colour not easily identifiable. The pall of cigarette smoke hung over the tables, though it had been a while since the smoking ban came into force. There was a raised stage to the left of the bar, and on it, under a splash of gaudy lights, a middle-aged, bleached blonde was slowly taking off her clothes. A group of young African men sat around the stage, staring into bottles of Primus, pulling on long, white-tipped cigarettes and watching the floor show. Carrigan felt a sharp pang of sadness. This whole scene, the stripper that no one in his right mind would want to see stripped, the dark and gloomy bar, the measure of cigarettes and spark of bottles being opened in the musty air. The woman took off her bra to reveal scars and stretch marks. The crowd cheered listlessly, like it was something they'd been instructed to do. It was only 2 p.m, a bright, glaring October day, but in here it could have been the middle of the night. The stripper smiled and tripped, falling over her own discarded clothes. No one looked up from their beers. Carrigan found a seat as Spencer went round trying to get some sort of reaction from the customers, shoving the photo under their eyes, standing in front of the stripper, blocking their view. Carrigan felt the mood change in the bar like a sailor could feel the tiniest splash of rain in a cloudless sky. Men were shuffling in their seats, some looking nervously behind them, others shaking their heads and raising their voices. They all shared a certain expression despite their differences, a surly nonchalance bubbling at the surface, a wariness like that of predatory birds. Carrigan moved next to Spencer, waiting for the first flare of fist or knife, but everything was muted here. The rage and violence distilled into stares and shrugs and monosyllabic rebuttals. The stripper continued her act, but no one was really watching, or they were only watching in the way you look at something but don't see it.
"What kind of black are you?"
one of the young men challenged Spencer. Spencer leant down into the youth's face.
"The kind you'll never be."
It happened so fast, Carrigan was caught completely unprepared. Suddenly, Spencer was surrounded, fists flying and the silver flash of something worse. Carrigan stepped into the swirling mass of bodies, pulling out his baton, hearing the click of its extension as he slammed it into one man's forearm. The crack of bone splintered cleanly, and the man fell to the floor sobbing and massaging his useless arm. Carrigan turned and hit another assailant in the face, but the man barely reacted, just smiled and jumped on top of Carrigan. Their bodies crashed to the floor. Carrigan felt the man's breath on his face, twisted and shot his knee into the man's crotch. The African's eyes bulged, but he didn't relax his grip on Jack's neck. Carrigan saw black skies explode in white star showers, then heard a sharp tattoo of cracks. Blood from his attacker's head began streaming down onto his own face. He pulled away to see Spencer standing with a truncheon in his hands, wide smile plastered on his face. Spencer pulled him up. The room tilted and span. Carrigan grabbed a table to steady himself, saw the men, bloodied and bruised, slowly taking their seats, Spencer leaning over them like their own shadows unloosed. He was taking out his handcuffs and notebook.
Assaulting a police officer is something we take very seriously around here.
Spencer's voice boomed across the afternoon pub, but there was no reaction on the men's faces. They stared at each other, at their useless hands, the mess surrounding them.
But assaulting two policemen.
"You're going to put us in jail," one of the men sneered, massaging his jaw, blood and spit curling at the edge of his lips. "We've been there before." Carrigan sat down next to Spencer, felt the heat of the table, the amassed looks and imperceptible nods and tells. He took the photo of Grace's sauce out of his pocket. "We have a fast-track program for you." His voice was unrattled, calm and modular despite the pain he was feeling in his ribs and skull. "Prison's being overcrowded here, and you not being legal residents and all." Carrigan watched their faces as he let the words hang in the smoky air. "So, for something like this, as serious as this, we just fill out a form and pass it on to your embassy." He scanned their eyes, saw tiny flickers at the mention of the word embassy. "Which means, practically speaking, 48 hours from now, you'll be on a plane back to your beloved homeland. What they do to you there, it's up to them." He leant back in the chair, watched their eyes fall on the photograph, silent looks exchanged across the long table. "A nice surprise for your families, I should think, having you back for Christmas." Someone reached for the photo. One of the younger men, scars like ripples across his cheeks, long skinny fingers caressing the edges of the paper. "You only want this man?" Carrigan nodded. Silence. No one looking at each other. The man who'd taken the photo sent it spinning back across the table. "Haven't seen him for a few weeks. He used to hang around with Solomon Onega." The man looked to his friends, but they avoided his gaze. "And where can we find Onega?" Carrigan kept his voice soft and low. "The Church of the Blood of the Redemption," the man mumbled. "He walks there most days." He looked up at Carrigan. "What about us?" Carrigan put the photo back in his pocket, snapped his truncheon back onto his belt. "Lucky you," he said, pointing to the stripper who was still gyrating on the stage. "You get to keep watching Marilyn over there to your heart's content." Chapter 25. Geneva waited as the SOAS registrar continued some private conversation on the phone. She stared at the sterile room, the cold white lights, the framed photographs of old alumni, feeling unreasonably tetchy. She had made the appointment after her meal with Carrigan last night, but this morning it seemed the registrar had more important things to do. Finally, tired of waiting, the case going on without her somewhere in Peckham, Hackney, Streatham, she walked up to his desk, loudly slamming her Coke can down on the table, watching his eyes follow the liquid as it splashed onto the wood. "Yes." His voice sounded weary and tired, but when he looked up and noticed her, something in his expression softened and he coughed, apologised, put down the phone and smiled. "What can I help you with?" She flashed her warrant card, noticing his surprise, the way he looked from the card back up to her face, as if convinced of some deception.